There is a specific kind of silence that only exists after a stadium empties. It is not peaceful, and it is not calm. It lingers the way smoke hangs in the air after a fire has burned out. You can still sense everything that happened there. The shouts, the collisions, the celebrations, the anger, the belief, the denial. It settles across the field like a thin film, as if the truth of what unfolded has not yet decided whether it wants to be remembered or forgotten. I have stood in that silence many times, and every time it reminds me that football carries a double life. There's the version the world sees, the polished spectacle wrapped in achievement and tradition. And then there is the version that has lived beneath it for generations. A version shaped not by purity, but by scandal. By the stories the league learned to bury because it believed America needed something unbroken. The myth of purity did not appear on its own. It was constructed. Every time the league was shaken by a moment that threatened the way people saw it, the response was not simply to solve the problem. The response was to rewrite the narrative. The early years of the league were filled with chaos. Clashes between owners, accusations of fixed games, players who lived harder off the field than they ever did on it. Yet, when the public asked what the NFL stood for, the message remained the same. Integrity, discipline, strength, honor. Fans never questioned it because it was easier to hold on to the myth than to confront the truth. And over time, that myth grew stronger than the events that challenged it. I have met players whose careers ended with a single decision, a single mistake, a single headline. Their stories disappeared so the league could preserve its own. I have spoken with men who walked onto the field as rising stars and walked off knowing their reputations had been quietly dismantled. Some were involved in scandals they caused. Others were pulled into scandals they never fully understood. A few became symbols of the league's attempt to appear righteous when it needed to look firm. They became cautionary tales crafted for public consumption. They became examples used to convince fans that the league was pure because it punished impurity. In truth, their stories reveal how carefully the NFL constructed that purity. Owners lived in a world even more protected. There were owners with financial histories steeped in questionable alliances. Owners with influence that reached into places the public never saw. Some shaped outcomes in ways that benefited them more than the sport. Some moved money in ways no one wanted to trace. Some made decisions that would have destroyed the reputation of any other institution. Yet their names remained untarnished because the league understood something important. If the Shield lost its leaders, it would lose its identity. And so those stories were muffled and softened. Sometimes they were erased entirely. Reporters learned early what stories could be told and what stories would never survive the printing process. Some fought to expose the truth because they believed football deserved to be honest. Many of those reporters found their access revoked or their careers quietly redirected. Others learned to shape their work around the boundaries the league did not want crossed. The result was an image of football that looked clean, even when the truth behind it was anything but. There were games that quickly became taboo to mention. Games where the point spread made more sense than the scoreboard. Games where late turnovers raised questions that no one wanted to ask publicly. Games that became part of private conversations among players. Coaches and insiders who understood that certain details were not meant to be investigated. Behind closed doors, the suspicion was acknowledged. In the public eye, the myth remained untouched. For years, I believed that the story of the NFL was the story of progress, innovation, triumph, and resilience. Those things are real, but they are only part of the story. The other part is what happened when the league realized that public trust was its most valuable currency. Scandals forced the league to choose between transparency and survival. Time and time again, it chose survival. Whenever a crisis emerged, the league constructed a version of events that preserved the belief that football represented the best of American ideals. It created a version of itself that appeared untouchable, even when everything behind the scenes suggested fragility. This raised a question I could never shake. Was the purity real, or was it simply something America needed to believe? For many fans, football was more than entertainment. It was ritual. It was heritage. It was family. It was identity. If the league appeared compromised, the meaning they attached to the sport would feel compromised too. So they embraced the polished version because it felt safer. The league understood this, and it used that understanding to shape its image for decades. Some of the most striking conversations I've ever had were with players who described the moment they realized the league was not what they thought it was. They idolized the Shield growing up. They believed it stood for discipline, responsibility, and honor. But once inside, they witnessed how scandals were handled, how secrets were managed, and how accountability often depended on status, power, and timing. A rookie might be punished harshly for a minor mistake because it created the appearance of strict values. A star might be protected because the league knew it could not afford to lose him. A team owner might skirt consequences entirely because the backlash would be too costly. The purity the league projected was never evenly applied. There were moments that could have shifted the entire trajectory of the league. Early gambling incidents threatened to destroy the foundation of professional football before it even found its footing. Violent episodes on and off the field demanded real introspection. Player deaths cast shadows that should have sparked immediate reform. Lawsuits briefed the public on truths the league resisted acknowledging. Each moment was an opportunity to confront the darker elements directly. Yet, instead of dismantling the myths, the league built a stronger version of them. Every crisis became a catalyst for reinforcing purity rather than questioning it. I think often about the concept of the final season, not the last season a player physically plays, but the season when he realizes he will never return to who he was. The season where truth cuts deeper than injury. The season when hopes collapse into recognition. The league has had its own final seasons. Moments when its image should have changed forever. Moments when the truth should have outweighed the myth. But each time, the league pushed forward with a new story, a new slogan, a new reminder that football was unshakable. Those seasons were buried. The myth remained intact. The question that lingers is whether the myth was ever meant to be believed, or whether it became a necessary illusion. America is drawn to stories of virtue. It is drawn to institutions that appear unblemished. The NFL understood this and built its public identity around it. The more scandals emerged, the more polished the image became. Purity did not grow from righteousness. It grew from the need to survive public scrutiny. As I look back across the long history of the sport, I see a pattern that repeats itself with remarkable precision. Crisis appears. Trust wavers. The league responds not with vulnerability, but with controlled narratives. By the time the next season begins, the public has been guided back to belief. Scandal becomes the foundation upon which the next layer of purity is built. Over time, that purity feels so ingrained that fans no longer question its origins. They simply accept it. This documentary begins at that crossroads where truth and myth collide. It begins with the recognition that the image of purity was not inherited. It was constructed out of necessity. It was shaped by scandal. It was strengthened by crisis. And it asks one question that echoes through every era of the league. If the purity we believe in is built on buried stories, forgotten players, silenced voices, and carefully managed narratives, then what does purity even mean? The silence in the stadium after the crowd leaves is heavy because it carries everything that happened and everything that was hidden. It carries the victories and the scandals. It carries the truth and the myth. It carries the reason this story matters now. The story of the National Football League is often told as a rise powered by discipline, order, and an unwavering commitment to American ideals. It is a story of grit and unity, of teams forged in small towns before growing into a national empire. But beneath that celebrated version of history lies a far more complicated truth. The league did not inherit its image of purity. It constructed it out of necessity. forging it through crises that threatened to expose its vulnerabilities. What many fans took for an unbroken lineage of moral authority was, in reality, the product of deliberate decisions made during some of the darkest moments in the sport's past. If the modern NFL appears polished, powerful, and morally anchored, it is only because generations of leaders spent decades trying to erase the memories of the chaos that once defined professional football. Across the 20th century, purity became one of the league's most valuable illusions. It was not simply a claim of athletic excellence, it was a cultural declaration. Purity meant that football could be trusted. Purity meant the players represented ideals larger than themselves. Purity meant the league's authority was unquestionable, that the sport's moral center was immune from scandal, corruption, or moral decay. In the mythology that eventually emerged, football stood as a guardian of patriotism, family values, discipline, and commitment to country. By the 1960s and 1970s, these themes were woven deeply into the narratives broadcast every Sunday. Yet none of this happened naturally. Each layer of myth-making rose from earlier eras in which the sport fought for its reputation in the face of turmoil that could have destroyed it. In the earliest decades of the NFL, the idea of purity did not exist. The league was founded in a haze of uncertain rules, unregulated teams, and loose financial agreements. It was difficult even to determine who genuinely played by the rules and who manipulated them. Gambling hung over the sport from the moment it formed. In the 1920s and 1930s, accusations of fixed games, bribed players, and dishonest clubs circulated freely. Some were proven. Others were whispered about in press boxes. All contributed to a perception that professional football was little more than a traveling spectacle. High school football was considered more respectable. College football was celebrated as the real version of the game. The NFL struggled to shake the image that it was unpredictable in all the wrong ways. By the 1930s, the league knew that survival depended on public trust. Scandals involving betting and game manipulation had made newspapers suspicious of the sport's legitimacy. Players moved between teams without contracts. Owners disappeared without paying salaries. Fans questioned whether the results they watched were real. The league's leaders realized that if they wanted respectability, they had to create a higher moral standard for themselves than any previous era had demanded. But in the world of early professional football, purity was not a natural condition. It was a goal that required structure, leadership, and a willingness to confront problems openly. The arrival of Commissioner Bert in 1946 began the league's first serious attempt to build this new identity. Bell understood that football needed more than better athletes or improved rules. It needed integrity that could withstand scrutiny. He championed single ownership of franchises to prevent financial instability. He implemented strict anti-gambling policies long before fans considered such measures normal. He accepted that the league could not simply hope that players made the right choices. It had to police itself. Bell believed the sport had a future only if the public believed in the honesty of the competition. His tenure was filled with constant vigilance, public messaging, and a stern insistence that the NFL would never tolerate any threat to its credibility. But even Bell could not fully erase the past. The league still struggled with reputation issues throughout the 1950s. For all its ambition, the NFL remained vulnerable to aging scandals that refused to disappear. Everything changed when television entered the picture. Television did not simply show the game to more people. It reshaped what the game was supposed to represent. With cameras capturing every play and commentators framing every storyline, the NFL saw an opportunity. If the league could present itself not only as a sport but as a national ritual, it could transform its identity forever. Purity became central to this transformation. Families watched together. Children admired players as role models. Broadcasters and league officials emphasized sportsmanship, teamwork, and national pride. The NFL realized that if it could align itself with the moral values American audiences cherished, it could rise above the scandals that once defined its early decades. Pete Rozelle emerged as the commissioner who perfected this vision. When he took office in 1960, he inherited a league facing competition, controversy, and internal division. Yet Rozelle saw the potential for something greater. He believed the league could serve as a symbol of unity in a rapidly changing country. His genius lay in crafting narratives that elevated football beyond mere entertainment. Under Rozelle's guidance, the idea of the NFL as a clean, dignified, morally consistent institution became a strategic priority. The sports leaders understood that to grow into a cultural force, it needed an image that felt untouchable. Rozelle enforced player conduct standards, controlled messaging to the press, and used televised games as a stage to portray the NFL as a beacon of order in a chaotic world. The league's mythology of purity was not a byproduct of virtue. It was a reinforcement of survival. Yet beneath the surface, the truth was more fragile. Scandals continued to appear. Arrests, player controversies, financial misconduct, fixing allegations, internal conflicts between owners. Each incident threatened to crack the carefully crafted facade, but the league responded not with passivity, but with strategy. Whenever a crisis reached the public, the NFL found ways to reshape the narrative, redirect attention, or bury the details. The sport had become a national treasure, and its leaders believed they were protecting something sacred. They were not just defending a game, but maintaining faith in an institution millions believed represented the best of America. In their view, purity was not merely an image, it was a shield. The 20 batches that follow will examine this tension between myth and reality. They will trace the scandals that shaped the league's image, revealing how each crisis forced the NFL to adapt. They will explore players whose lives contradicted the ideals they were expected to represent, showing how the league balanced punishment, silence, or redemption, depending on its needs. They will analyze the institutional responses that emerged whenever the Shield faced existential threats. These responses formed the foundation of a powerful public relations system capable of protecting the league's reputation for generations. Most importantly, this exploration will reveal the rise of narrative control, the machinery that turned the NFL into one of the most carefully managed cultural institutions in modern history. From early gambling allegations to modern controversies, the story of the league is not simply the story of competition. It is the story of how an organization transforms scandal into structure, chaos into order, and history into myth. For many fans, the NFL became a symbol of purity because it appeared immune to the flaws that affect every other institution. But purity was never the natural state of the league. It was built, maintained, defended, and reinvented whenever the truth threatened to surface. In the beginning, professional football was a fragile idea held together by improvisation, handshakes, and the hope that enough spectators would pay a few dollars to watch men collide in muddy fields. Nothing about the early NFL resembled stability. Teams appeared and vanished in the span of 2 seasons. Owners were often local businessmen who treated franchises like weekend experiments. Players moved between clubs without contracts or loyalty. Stadiums were borrowed. Equipment was inconsistent. The young league survived week to week, driven by ambition rather than structure. Yet the greatest threat to its existence did not come from financial instability or competition from baseball and college football. It came from a crisis that forced the league to confront what it stood for before it was even sure it would live long enough to decide. The crisis of game fixing, bribery, and manipulated outcomes arrived before the league had formed an identity. And it nearly destroyed the foundation before the concrete had hardened. In the early 1920s, rumors of fixed games followed the NFL like a shadow. Some teams were accused of accepting money to alter the results. Some players quietly admitted that they had been approached to influence outcomes. Others insisted such claims were invented by angry gamblers. Newspapers reported questionable results with raised eyebrows. Every allegation, whether proven or not, added to the perception that professional football was not simply unpredictable, but compromised. The league was still young, and its reputation had not yet solidified in the eyes of the public. When whispers began circulating about games that did not unfold naturally, the entire enterprise seemed suddenly vulnerable. The most infamous incident involved the Milwaukee Badgers in 1925. The Badgers, struggling to compete and desperate for a roster, reportedly used high school players in a professional game. The decision alone would have been embarrassing. But the scandal deepened when accusations emerged that the game itself had been arranged under suspicious circumstances. The incident hinted at a league lacking basic safeguards. If one team could circumvent rules so blatantly, what prevented others from accepting bribes or fixing outcomes for financial gain? Critics argued that professional football had become little more than a chaotic spectacle where honesty was optional. The scandal drew the attention of the league office, which recognized the danger immediately. If the public believed the results were manipulated, no fan would pay to watch. The league could collapse overnight. Another crisis erupted that same season, involving the Chicago Cardinals and a controversial game against the Milwaukee club. The Cardinals, in pursuit of the league championship, played an additional game under circumstances that many observers considered unethical. Although the league later addressed the situation, the damage had already been done. Fans questioned whether standings could be trusted. Writers accused the NFL of lacking control over its own competitions. The sense of disorder was overwhelming. The league was still trying to establish legitimacy. And these incidents threatened to define its identity before it had even chosen one for itself. At the heart of these scandals was a deeper fear. Professional football did not yet command the respect college football enjoyed. College teams played in massive stadiums, drew national media coverage, and were seen as wholesome representations of youthful discipline and institutional pride. The NFL, by contrast, felt rough, improvised, and vulnerable to corruption. Every accusation reinforced the belief that college football was the pure version of the sport, while the professional game existed in a murky, unreliable space. If the NFL continued on this path, it risked becoming a financial footnote. The league needed not only order, but a philosophy. It needed a reason for fans to believe in the sport as something more than a chaotic competition, vulnerable to manipulation. In response, the NFL's leaders began constructing the earliest version of the narrative that would define the league for decades. They recognized that survival depended on more than preventing scandals. It depended on creating an identity that directly opposed the accusations threatening the sport. Football, they insisted, stood for integrity. Football was honest competition. Football represented fairness. Football would not tolerate anything that compromised its legitimacy. These ideas did not arise from a long tradition. They were created out of crisis. The league had to present itself as a protector of truth, as an institution guided by moral clarity, even if it was still learning how to enforce that clarity in practice. The punishment for the Milwaukee scandal was one of the strongest signals of this new approach. The league president at the time, Joseph Carr, took decisive action. He fined the team. He sanctioned the owner. He declared the use of ineligible players unacceptable in a professional sport seeking national legitimacy. Carr understood that the NFL could not afford to appear uncertain. The message had to be firm. The league would not allow manipulation, dishonesty, or irresponsibility to define it. At a time when stability was rare, this assertive stance became one of the first building blocks of the NFL's later image. Carr's leadership did not eliminate scandal, but it signaled that the league had boundaries. He believed the NFL had the potential to become a respected institution, but only if it committed to transparency and discipline. He insisted on standardized contracts. He pushed for clearer rules. He demanded accountability from owners. In these early decisions, the league began shaping the moral identity it would later protect fiercely. This did not come from an inherent purity, but from a recognition that without integrity, the league would not survive financially or culturally. The creation of the integrity narrative during this period was not an accident. It was a strategic decision rooted in survival. The league needed a story that contrasted sharply with its chaotic reputation. It needed something fans could believe in, something that suggested professional football was more than a business venture. The idea that football embodied honesty and discipline became a kind of shield. It positioned the sport as a moral force in a country longing for trustworthy institutions. Although the early NFL had little proof to support these claims, the narrative began to take root because it offered something people wanted to believe. The league-ass leaders saw that fans responded not only to athletic ability, but to the promise of fairness. People wanted to feel that the result of a game was earned. They wanted to connect the sport to values that extended beyond the field. They wanted to trust that the players and teams were participating in an honest contest. The league realized that if it could cultivate this trust, it could endure even financial difficulties. Integrity became the central theme of early NFL messaging because it served both an ethical purpose and a practical one. It allowed the league to distance itself from its past without denying it openly. The narrative that football stands for integrity was born in this era of crisis. It was not the product of a stable institution, but the reaction of a vulnerable one. The NFL understood that public perception would decide its fate. Every scandal threatened to shrink the sport back into regional obscurity. Every accusation risked undoing the fragile legitimacy the league had begun to build. But with each crisis, the NFL refined its message. It tightened its rules. It presented itself as a guardian of honesty, even as it struggled to enforce standards across a decentralized and financially unstable structure. This early battle between chaos and control shaped the league more profoundly than any on-field innovation. Before professional football had established rivalries, iconic franchises, or national broadcasts, it built the idea that purity mattered. The sport could be brutal and unpredictable, but its integrity had to remain unquestioned. The league fought for that belief long before it had the strength to defend it consistently. The fixed game scandals of the 1920s forced the NFL to define itself not by what it had achieved, but by what it refused to tolerate. The irony is that the league's image of purity began not with virtue, but with fear. The NFL needed to appear clean because the alternative was collapse. It needed a moral identity because without one, it had no path to national trust. What emerged from this period was a commitment to the idea that football represented fairness above all else. Even when the league fell short of this ideal, it would continue to shape its messaging around it. Integrity became both its promise and its aspiration. From the ruins of early scandal, the NFL found a guiding principle that would follow it into every decade that came after. There was a moment in the early history of professional football when the violence that lived inside the sport could no longer be hidden behind heroic storytelling or the familiar thrill of competition. As the league tried to distance itself from the scandals that threatened its legitimacy, another force pulled at its reputation. The physical brutality of football, long accepted as part of the game, began to shock the public when the consequences became impossible to ignore. For years, the sport had existed in the shadows of college football, where pageantry softened the perception of danger. But when the professional game began attracting more attention and more spectators, the collisions grew louder. The injuries became more visible. The toll on the bodies of players revealed a truth that threatened the sport as deeply as any fixed game scandal. Football was becoming a spectacle defined not only by skill and strategy, but by violence carried out in full view of an audience that was both fascinated and disturbed. In the 1930s, newspapers covered on-field injuries with a tone of disbelief. Reporters described scenes where players lay motionless on the ground while teammates and coaches ran to their side. Fans watched from wooden bleachers as young men absorbed hits that left them concussed, unconscious, or permanently damaged. Many of those sitting in the stands had never witnessed such physical extremes. The brutality challenged the idea that football was a wholesome competition. The league understood the danger this perception posed. Too much violence could make the sport appear barbaric. too little acknowledgement of that violence could make the league appear indifferent. The NFL had to balance two realities. The collisions were part of the game, yet the public needed reassurance that the sport was not spiraling into brutality without oversight. The hit that changed the tone of conversation took place in a period when the league was still developing its identity. A player was struck so hard that he never recovered fully. His career ended abruptly. His name was printed in papers across the country with descriptions that felt closer to war correspondence than sports reporting. Fans who had once celebrated the toughness of football suddenly questioned whether the game had crossed a line. The league responded by speaking emphatically about discipline, rule enforcement, and sportsmanship. The message was clear. The NFL controlled its players. The NFL valued fairness. The NFL was not a reckless spectacle. This response was intended to preserve the image the league had begun constructing. Football was physical, but it was also honorable. The violence was part of competition, not chaos. This was the moment when the league realized that violence was both an asset and a liability. Spectators were drawn to the intensity. They admired the strength and courage of the players who collided with such force. The danger created a sense of drama that other sports struggled to match. But that same danger threatened to push the sport beyond the boundaries of acceptable entertainment. If the violence appeared unrestrained, critics would argue that professional football was too dangerous to be supported by respectable institutions. The league was forced to respond by shaping a narrative that acknowledged the physical nature of the game while promising moral order. The NFL began emphasizing the discipline of the athletes. It described them as men who played with control and respect. League officials described the rules as safeguards designed to ensure fairness and reduce unnecessary harm. These explanations were intended not only for the players, but for the public. The NFL had learned from earlier scandals that reputation could determine survival. It understood now that violence, if viewed as spectacle without structure, could create a different kind of crisis. The league had to convince fans that football demanded toughness, but not recklessness. That the game tested limits, but did not exist without them. That the players chose these collisions with honor rather than malice. One key figure in this effort was the commissioner, Bert. Bell was deeply aware that every violent incident threatened the league's fragile public standing. He worked to introduce rules that protected players without altering the fundamental nature of the sport. Bell believed football had to evolve, not in a way that reduced the competition, but in a way that reassured the public that the league acted responsibly. Under his leadership, the NFL began tracking injuries. It promoted the idea that the league cared for the well-being of the athletes. The message repeated as often as needed. Football was intense, but football was safe enough to trust. This balancing act shaped the culture of the league as it entered the middle of the 20th century. Even as players grew stronger and faster, the NFL insisted that order guided the sport. It was a strategy that acknowledged the reality of violence while shaping the narrative around it. The league portrayed violent plays as controlled expressions of athleticism rather than dangerous collisions without restraint. Fans embraced this framing because it allowed them to enjoy the action without feeling complicit in potential harm. If the league said the players were protected, then spectators could continue cheering without guilt. The truth, however, was far more complex. Players continued to suffer devastating injuries. Some never returned to the field. Others lived with chronic pain that shaped the rest of their lives. But the league, determined to maintain the purity narrative it had been building, presented football as a noble form of competition. Players were described as warriors who accepted risk. The league positioned itself as the guardian that ensured fairness, discipline, and respect. This story appealed to a country that admired toughness but also believed in moral clarity. The NFL understood that the perception of order mattered as much as the rules themselves. It was during this era that violence transitioned from a hidden reality to a central element of the public identity of football. Fans began to expect bone-shaking hits. They celebrated defensive players who became legends for their physical dominance. Newspapers wrote about collisions with awe rather than caution. The league embraced the marketing power of physicality, though not openly. The narrative was subtle but effective. Football demanded strength and courage, and the players delivered these qualities with every collision. The spectacle of the sport became a key part of its appeal, and the NFL allowed this transformation as long as it could reassure the public that everything remained under control. The contradiction was unmistakable. The league depended on violence for entertainment value while simultaneously warning that it was working to limit excessive harm. It promoted a moral image while benefiting from moments that challenged that same image. Yet the NFL managed this contradiction through careful framing. It emphasized sportsmanship, discipline, and respect whenever a violent incident unsettled the public. It punished players selectively, not always consistently, but with enough visibility to maintain the illusion of strict oversight. In doing so, the league strengthened the purity narrative. Violence was not a sign of chaos, but a test of character. Hard hits were not signs of danger, but expressions of commitment. This strategy laid the foundation for the future. As the sport grew, the hits grew louder. Television brought the collisions into living rooms. Slowed replays captured impacts that once disappeared in the blur of fast action. Broadcasters described these moments in excited tones that transformed danger into spectacle. The audience responded with increasing enthusiasm. The league responded with carefully crafted statements about safety and discipline. The purity narrative evolved, but the underlying tension remained. Football thrived on violence, but it had to define that violence as controlled and dignified. This period marks a crucial turning point in the NFL story. The league learned that shaping perception was as important as shaping rules. It recognized that public trust could be maintained even when the reality on the field was painful and dangerous. It realized that fans would continue to support the sport as long as they believed the league acted with moral authority. Violence became both the challenge and the opportunity. It became the defining contradiction that the league would spend decades managing through policy, messaging, and cultural framing. The early brutal incidents that shocked fans did more than test the league's limits. They shaped its identity. They forced the NFL to present itself as the guardian of discipline, even as the sport's popularity grew through moments that bordered on the extreme. They taught the league how to speak about danger without acknowledging the full weight of consequence. They pushed the NFL to insist that football represented character and honor, even when the evidence suggested a more complicated reality. By the time the league entered the modern era, the idea of football as a disciplined and morally grounded sport had taken root. The image had been carefully built, reinforced by decades of messaging that framed violence as a controlled part of the experience. Yet beneath that image lived the truth that the NFL would spend generations managing. The spectacle of violence had become inseparable from the sport, and the purity narrative had become the shield that made it acceptable. Professional football has always had two faces. On the field, the game presents the clarity of rules, the drama of competition, and the disciplined heroism of athletes who embody toughness and determination. Off the field, however, the sport has long been shaped by forces far less visible. The league's early history is filled with owners who operated in the shadows. Some had questionable financial practices. Others maintained ties to gambling networks and organized crime. Some exercised influence quietly, manipulating schedules, controlling player movements, or interfering with outcomes in ways the public would never know. The contrast between what fans saw and what existed behind the scenes is fundamental to understanding how the NFL built its public identity of purity while protecting powerful men whose personal dealings threatened that very image. In the 1930s and 1940s, the league attracted entrepreneurs who saw football as an opportunity to build status, prestige, and profit. They were often ambitious, sometimes ruthless, and occasionally morally compromised. The earliest owners were not bound by ethical standards the way modern executives are expected to be. The The league had rules, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some owners exploited this inconsistency to protect financial interests or secure advantages over rivals. Others found themselves in networks that intersected with gambling interests or organized crime figures, creating opportunities for influence that could compromise the integrity of games. In an era before televised accountability, few in the public knew how intertwined these worlds could become. One prominent case involved an owner in the Midwest who faced allegations of associating with illegal bookmaking operations. Reports suggested that he had connections to men who bet on football outcomes across multiple cities. And there were rumors that games were occasionally influenced to suit certain wagers. The league investigated quietly, issuing reprimands that were never widely publicized. Publicly, the team remained a model of professionalism, its owner lauded for leadership and commitment. The story demonstrates the way the NFL protected its most influential members while maintaining the illusion that every team, player, and game upheld the values of fairness and integrity. Protecting these owners was a delicate balancing act. The NFL had to preserve its reputation while also preserving the financial and political power of men who controlled the teams. Removing an owner for questionable associations could destabilize a franchise, alienate other investors, or create a public spectacle that contradicted the purity narrative the league was cultivating. Instead, the league developed a strategy of controlled discretion. Investigations were conducted quietly. Punishments were measured, often symbolic rather than substantive. Statements were crafted to reassure the public without exposing systemic vulnerabilities. In this way, the NFL could appear as an institution committed to ethical standards while simultaneously safeguarding the very individuals whose actions threaten those standards. This duality defined the league for decades. Owners with influence were rarely publicly criticized, yet their decisions shaped the trajectory of teams, players, and even the sport itself. Some used their power to recruit key talent or block competitors. Others influenced rule changes to benefit their franchises. While these interventions were rarely acknowledged outside the league office, they formed an invisible architecture that dictated outcomes across the NFL. To the public, games appeared to be fair contests between equals. Behind the scenes, results could be affected by choices the league would never admit. The story of these hidden forces extends into the post-war era. In the 1950s, as television amplified the league's visibility, the tension between public image and private reality intensified. Owners were increasingly celebrated as patriarchs of a national institution, while the league simultaneously polished the myth of moral superiority. Media coverage presented football as disciplined, orderly, and virtuous, while the financial and political dealings of powerful owners remained obscured. Journalists who attempted to investigate connections to gambling or impropriety often found their access restricted. The league recognized that transparency in some cases would do more harm than good. Protecting the shield required protecting those who held it, even if their personal conduct contradicted the message of purity. Mob ties in particular presented a unique challenge. During the mid-20th century, organized crime maintained influence over entertainment, sports, and gambling in many American cities. Some NFL owners had peripheral or active connections to these networks. These connections occasionally influenced the financial health of teams, the placement of franchises, or even the availability of stadium contracts. The league was aware that exposure could be catastrophic. If the public discovered that professional football was entangled with illicit organizations, the carefully cultivated perception of discipline and moral authority could crumble. The response was deliberate obfuscation. League officials investigated discreetly, issued private warnings, and ensured that public messaging never hinted at controversy. Despite these behind-the-scenes compromises, the NFL continued to build its narrative of purity. Media guides, league statements, and promotional materials emphasized sportsmanship, patriotism, and the character of players and leadership. Television broadcasts reinforced this image, portraying owners as principled men committed to their communities and franchises. The contrast between narrative and reality became a defining characteristic of the league. Publicly, the sport represented moral clarity. Privately, the system relied on discretion, selective enforcement, and strategic silence. The paradox extended to relationships among owners themselves. Some exercised power aggressively, leveraging influence to secure scheduling advantages, restrict player mobility, or pressure rivals into decisions that benefited their interests. Others maintained alliances that insulated them from accountability, ensuring that allegations of impropriety rarely reached the public eye. The league, faced with the choice of exposing misconduct or preserving the appearance of unity, consistently opted for the latter. Protecting reputation took precedence over revealing truth. The NFL learned that maintaining faith in the institution required a coordinated effort to shield influential figures from scrutiny. These decisions shaped the culture of the league profoundly. Owners understood that their personal conduct could be managed by discretion, but they also recognized the stakes of public perception. The message was consistent. The league stands for integrity, discipline, and fairness, but the cost of preserving that image often required selective silence. This tension between public narrative and private reality is a through line in NFL history. It would recur in later decades as new scandals emerged, each time testing the league's ability to balance authority, profitability, and morality. For players, this dynamic was both inspiring and troubling. On one hand, they could rely on a framework that elevated the sport above chaos. On the other hand, they understood that outcomes could be influenced by forces they could not see. The integrity that defined their contracts, punishments, and public recognition existed alongside invisible levers controlled by powerful owners. This duality was rarely discussed publicly, but it informed the way athletes navigated the league, how they measured risk, and how they interpreted fairness. The narrative of purity was real in its effects, even if the mechanisms sustaining it were often hidden. The first lessons of owner protection set a precedent that would last generations. The league demonstrated that scandal did not need to be eliminated entirely. It needed to be managed, framed, and contained. In doing so, the NFL built the foundation of its most enduring asset, credibility. Fans could cheer, knowing the sport appeared moral, disciplined, and just, even if some of the men behind the scenes operated in morally gray or illicit territory. The paradox became a defining characteristic of the league, one that ensured stability while shaping the mythology that fans embraced. The tension between the spectacle of football and the private dealings of owners illustrates a critical truth about the NFL. The purity it projected was forged through careful management of perception. Scandal was inevitable, but the public would rarely encounter it. Ownership became a shield, a network of influence protected by the league's strategic discretion. The narrative of discipline and moral authority was crafted not in spite of these realities, but because of them. It was the only way the league could survive and eventually thrive as a national institution. Owners in the shadows were not just participants in the game. They were architects of the mythology that allowed football to grow. Their influence, often hidden, shaped the rules, the messaging, and the boundaries of acceptable conduct. The league protected them not out of naivety, but out of necessity, knowing that exposure could undermine decades of carefully cultivated trust. The result was an institution that appeared unblemished to the public, while navigating morally complex realities behind closed doors. The success of this strategy is evident in the league's endurance and rise to prominence. But the cost was a duality that would define professional football for generations. When Bert assumed the role of commissioner in 1946, the National Football League faced challenges that extended far beyond wins and losses. The sport had survived early scandals, violent controversies, and a roster of owners whose private dealings complicated the league's public identity. Bell recognized that if football was to flourish in the post-war era, it would need more than athletic competition or organizational stability. It would need a deliberate moral framework, a cultivated image that reassured the public that professional football represented discipline, integrity, and character. Bell approached the role with the understanding that the league's future depended as much on perception as performance. In many ways, he became the architect of the NFL's first comprehensive strategy of image management. Bell inherited a league still haunted by whispers of corruption. Fixed games, gambling rumors, and questionable conduct by players and owners lingered in the memories of journalists and fans alike. He realized that past crises could be leveraged not only as warnings, but as tools to structure the organization. Every scandal represented an opportunity to codify rules, strengthen enforcement, and communicate the league's commitment to integrity. Bell's approach was proactive. He did not merely react to crises as they emerged. He anticipated their effect on public perception and used them to build a narrative that the NFL was fundamentally moral, organized, and disciplined. One of Bell's first priorities was to standardize contracts and clarify ownership obligations. Early in the league's history, ambiguity had allowed unscrupulous behavior. Teams dissolved mid-season, salaries went unpaid, and players moved without constraint. Bell insisted that all franchises operate under clear agreements, with expectations defined and consequences established for violations. He framed these actions as necessary, not only for financial stability, but for the moral legitimacy of the sport. Bell understood that the public could tolerate mistakes, but only if the league appeared capable of addressing them. Rules were as much about optics as enforcement. They allowed the NFL to present itself as a guardian of fairness and accountability. In an era when professional sports were often viewed as chaotic or corrupt, Bell also recognized the importance of disciplined messaging. He cultivated relationships with reporters and editors, ensuring that the league could guide how stories were told. Controversial incidents were not ignored, but they were reframed. The narrative emphasized that football held its participants to high standards, punished misconduct decisively, and maintained fairness above all else. In doing so, Bell transformed potential threats into opportunities to reinforce the league's identity. Scandals became teaching moments, demonstrating the organization's commitment to principles rather than simply exposing failures. This approach laid the foundation for what would become the league's enduring public relations strategy. The commissioner's influence extended beyond policy and messaging to the very culture of the league. Bell emphasized player conduct, insisting that athletes understood they were public figures, representing not only their teams, but the ideals of the sport itself. He introduced behavioral standards, promoting sportsmanship and personal discipline. Bell framed these expectations as a moral contract between players and fans. Athletes were not merely competitors. They were exemplars of the integrity that the league sought to project. By linking personal behavior to institutional legitimacy, Bell transformed individual accountability into a tool for collective image management. One notable instance involved a high-profile player whose off-field behavior drew public criticism. Rather than respond defensively, Bell used the situation to reinforce league values. He sanctioned the player but also highlighted broader policies designed to maintain order. In press statements, the commissioner framed the punishment as a reaffirmation of football's principles. The episode illustrated Bell's understanding that transparency and moral authority were intertwined. By publicly acknowledging missteps while emphasizing corrective action, he demonstrated that the league could handle crises without undermining its reputation. Bell also leveraged structural reforms to signal moral progress. He reorganized league offices, standardized reporting procedures, and instituted oversight mechanisms that monitored both player and owner conduct. These measures created the appearance of an institution capable of self-regulation. The reforms were practical in their immediate effect, but symbolic in their long-term impact. They allowed the NFL to position itself as more than a collection of franchises competing for profit. The league became an organized body with ethical obligations, committed to fairness, discipline, and oversight. For the first time, the public could perceive professional football as an institution with moral authority rather than as a loosely coordinated enterprise subject to the whims of its most powerful members. At the same time, Bell understood that image management was inseparable from narrative control. Scandals, accidents, and controversies were inevitable in a violent and unpredictable sport. Instead of denying or hiding these realities, he emphasized the league's capacity to respond effectively. Every incident became an opportunity to demonstrate discipline and reinforce public trust. Whether a player broke a rule, a team violated policy, or rumors threatened credibility, Bell framed the league as proactive, principled, and morally consistent. This approach allowed the NFL to cultivate a mythos of ethical excellence while contending with the imperfections that were inherent to the sport. The commissioner's strategic vision was rooted in a clear understanding of human perception. He recognized that fans did not simply respond to statistics or scores. They responded to stories, symbolism, and the assurance that the institutions they supported operated within an ethical framework. Bell used this insight to shape messaging that emphasized the values of football as a reflection of broader social ideals. Integrity, discipline, fairness, and loyalty became as central to the league's identity as athletic skill or competitive success. In framing professional football as a morally grounded endeavor, Bell effectively transformed the perception of the sport in ways that would endure for decades. Bell's influence extended to relationships with team owners as well. He established clear boundaries regarding behavior and expectations, while simultaneously protecting the league's stability. Owners were guided toward conduct that reinforced the narrative of integrity. Yet they were also shielded from public scrutiny unless violations threatened credibility directly. Bell understood that a careful balance was necessary. Owners needed latitude to operate effectively, but they also needed to embody the principles the league projected. His leadership created a system in which ethical appearance became inseparable from organizational functionality. In retrospect, Bert Bell's tenure represents the birth of modern NFL image management. He recognized that scandals and crises were not solely threats, but tools to build structure and reinforce narrative. The league's moral identity was forged through deliberate interventions, careful messaging, and the cultivation of accountability that extended from the commissioner's office to players, coaches, and owners. Bell demonstrated that a sport defined by violence, unpredictability, and high stakes could maintain credibility if it presented itself as disciplined, principled, and morally coherent. The foundation Bell laid became the blueprint for later generations of league leadership. Television broadcasts, national sponsorships, and expansive media coverage would later amplify these lessons. By reframing the league as morally upright, Bell provided the NFL with the tools to navigate the inevitable contradictions between spectacle, competition, and ethical perception. He created a template in which public trust could coexist with the complex realities of professional sport. The work of reputation management, crisis framing, and narrative cultivation that began under his leadership would shape the league's identity long after his death. Bert Bell's strategy demonstrates that purity in professional football was not a natural condition. It was the result of deliberate design. Scandals were not erased, they were harnessed. Crises were not ignored, they were reframed. The league's moral authority was manufactured, structured, and communicated with a precision that would define its enduring public image. Bell understood that perception and reality rarely align perfectly, but perception shapes loyalty, legitimacy, and survival. The narrative of a disciplined, principled, and morally consistent league was born in this era. Anchored in strategic leadership and reinforced through decades of consistent messaging. When Pete Rozelle became commissioner in 1960, the National Football League was on the cusp of transformation. Television was emerging as the primary medium for sports consumption, offering access to millions of viewers who had never attended a game in person. The stakes were higher than ever. The league had built an image of integrity, but the visibility created by national broadcasts made every misstep potentially catastrophic. Rozelle recognized that the survival and growth of the NFL depended not just on football itself, but on the story the league told about football. He understood that public perception could be as powerful as performance. His tenure would become defined by a mastery of narrative control that earned him the nickname the Architect of the League's Golden Shield. Rozelle inherited a league still navigating the legacy of past scandals, both on and off the field. Players had been disciplined, owners protected, and rules established. But the growing power of television demanded a new level of sophistication. Audiences could now see and judge every hit, every penalty, and every controversial call. Newspaper reports were amplified by broadcast commentary, creating an environment in which the NFL could no longer simply assert moral authority without demonstrating it. Rozelle responded by transforming the way the league managed both information and perception. He established what would become a sophisticated public relations apparatus that monitored and influenced the narrative surrounding every aspect of the sport. At the heart of Rozelle's strategy was the recognition that PR could be wielded as a weapon. The league did not simply communicate facts, it framed them. It highlighted virtues, minimized controversy, and created storylines that emphasized character, discipline, and fairness. Publicly, every team, every player, and every commissioner's decision was positioned within a moral narrative that reinforced the idea that football was not only exciting, but principled. Scandals were inevitable, but they could be contained and reframed. Missteps were presented as isolated incidents, swiftly addressed to reinforce the league's commitment to integrity. Rozelle understood that consistency in messaging created credibility, and that credibility, in turn, protected the league from scrutiny that might threaten its growth. One of the earliest tests of Rozelle's approach involved player conduct controversies. As football became more physically intense, incidents on the field occasionally escalated into public scandals. Rozelle and his communications team responded by emphasizing punishment and accountability. Penalties were framed not only as corrective, but as demonstrations of ethical oversight. The public saw swift action, while the underlying complexities and potential contradictions remained largely hidden. Rozelle's messaging emphasized moral clarity, ensuring that fans could continue to trust the league even when the realities of violence and competition presented moral ambiguity. Television contracts provided Rozelle with both opportunity and risk. National broadcasts brought unprecedented revenue, but also unprecedented exposure. Every hit, every penalty, every argument in the locker room could be witnessed by millions. The league needed to craft a narrative that made the game appear safe, principled, and morally coherent even as it showcased physical intensity. Rozelle created a coordinated approach in which public statements, media coverage, and internal discipline worked together to present a consistent image. The league's story was carefully curated. Football was a test of character as much as of skill. Violence was controlled. Competition was fair. Athletes were exemplars of discipline. This narrative, delivered repeatedly across multiple media channels, became the shield that protected the league from the chaos inherent in its own product. Rozelle also understood the power of symbolism. He emphasized the heroism and dedication of players, the fairness of officiating, and the honor of coaches. High-profile incidents were framed as lessons in accountability rather than evidence of systemic failure. The commissioner cultivated relationships with journalists, broadcasters, and sponsors, ensuring that the story the league wanted to tell was amplified consistently. Transparency was selective, enough to maintain credibility, but never so thorough as to expose vulnerabilities that could erode trust. This deliberate control of information elevated the role of PR from a reactive function to a proactive instrument of governance. Scandals under Rozelle were rare in comparison to the media coverage, but when they occurred, the league's response was calculated. Players caught in ethical or behavioral controversy were disciplined publicly, while investigations into owners or management were handled privately. The focus was always on preserving the perception of integrity. Fans were reassured that football adhered to rules of morality and fairness. The narrative of purity, first articulated by Bell and refined over decades, was now enforced through systematic media strategy. Public relations became an extension of authority. a mechanism through which the league could shape both reality and perception to protect its brand. The Golden Shield extended to labor relations as well. Kai's television revenue soared. The NFL faced pressures from players seeking higher salaries and better working conditions. Rozelle approached these disputes with a dual strategy of negotiation and messaging. Publicly, he emphasized the league's commitment to fairness and professionalism. Behind closed doors, he navigated the complexities of contract disputes, free agency, and emerging union pressures. By controlling how the negotiations were framed, Rozelle ensured that fans viewed the league as ethical and stable, even when players and teams were engaged in contentious debates. The PR machinery reinforced the notion that the NFL operated under a higher standard, even in moments of internal tension. Rozelle's approach relied on the disciplined repetition of core narratives. Violence, controversy, labor disputes, and competition were all presented within a moral framework that reinforced the league's image. Every action was calibrated to support the perception of integrity, creating a continuity of messaging that spanned years and decades. The public learned to associate professional football with fairness, discipline, and honor, while the internal mechanisms that maintained this image remained largely invisible. This was the essence of Rozelle's Golden Shield, a protective barrier constructed from narrative, media management, and carefully orchestrated accountability. The effectiveness of this strategy is evident in the league's growth during Rozelle's tenure. Television contracts multiplied, fan bases expanded nationally, and the NFL became one of the most profitable and influential sports organizations in America. Each success reinforced the perception that the league was disciplined, principled, and trustworthy. Controversies that might have derailed a less sophisticated institution were absorbed into the narrative, transformed into demonstrations of moral oversight rather than evidence of systemic weakness. Rozelle's Golden Shield allowed football to thrive even as the underlying complexities of competition, labor, and governance continued to present challenges. The broader implication of Rozelle's approach is clear. Professional sports do not exist solely as contests of skill or athleticism. They exist within a cultural framework that defines what is acceptable, admirable, and worthy of support. The NFL under Rozelle mastered the art of shaping that framework. By integrating narrative control, public relations, and strategic discipline, the league ensured that scandals, controversies, and conflicts did not compromise the institution. The Golden Shield became both a metaphor and a method. It protected the league, reinforced credibility, and allowed the sport to grow exponentially without losing the moral authority that fans had come to expect. Rozelle's tenure represents the peak of institutional image management. The lessons he applied remain visible in the NFL today. Scandals are framed, ethical narratives are reinforced, and public perception is carefully cultivated to maintain credibility. The sport's growth was inseparable from the sophisticated control of narrative, demonstrating that in professional football, what the public believes can be as important as what actually occurs on the field. The Golden Shield was never tangible, yet it became the most essential element of the league's survival and expansion. By the early 1960s, professional football had entered a new era defined by the glow of television screens in living rooms across America. The National Football League, once a regional enterprise, became a national spectacle, with cameras capturing every pass, tackle, and touchdown. The league achieved a level of visibility that transformed both the sport and its cultural significance. Football was no longer confined to stadiums or newspapers. It was now broadcast into homes, dinner rooms, and bars, becoming an integral part of American life. This transition elevated the stakes of every scandal, amplified the impact of every controversy, and provided the league with an unprecedented instrument to shape its public identity. Television was not merely a medium. It became a sanctuary where the NFL could project its carefully cultivated image of discipline, morality, and purity. Television demanded performance not only from players, but from the league itself. Viewers now witnessed the physicality of football in a way that was previously unimaginable. Every collision, every hard tackle, and every injury was visible in real time. The intensity that had once been thrilling on the field could now appear brutal and excessive in the living room. The league quickly recognized that its public image required careful orchestration. Scandals that might have been contained in print media now had the potential to reach millions instantly. Each incident demanded a response that reassured viewers, preserved trust, and reinforced the notion that football was morally grounded, disciplined, and fair. Television both heightened risk and expanded opportunity for narrative control. The rise of televised games coincided with an era in which the league's public relations strategy matured into a sophisticated operation. Every aspect of coverage was subject to scrutiny and framing. Announcers, network producers, and league officials worked together to present football as emblematic of American ideals: teamwork, perseverance, resilience, and respect for rules. Even controversies were shaped into moral narratives. When a player was penalized for misconduct, the commentary emphasized accountability and ethical standards. When games became particularly violent, broadcasts highlighted the skill and discipline behind each collision rather than the raw danger. Television transformed incidents into stories of character and heroism, aligning the spectacle with the league's broader image of purity. One early example illustrates the league's evolving approach. During a nationally televised game in the late 1960s, a hard hit left a player temporarily unconscious. The cameras captured the moment in vivid detail, and the broadcast brought the drama into homes across the country. Rather than allowing viewers to perceive the incident solely as a shocking act of violence, the league coordinated statements emphasizing the player's resilience, the promptness of medical attention, and the enforcement of rules. The narrative presented the collision as part of the disciplined rigor of professional football, a demonstration of courage and commitment rather than recklessness. This marked a new approach to scandal management: theatrical responses designed to reinforce values and maintain trust in real time. Television also allowed the league to define football as a reflection of American ideals beyond the field. Networks and league officials highlighted narratives of patriotism, teamwork, and hard work. Stories of players overcoming adversity, contributing to their communities, or demonstrating leadership were integrated into broadcasts. Scandals were reframed to fit within this context, illustrating the league's ability to correct misbehavior and uphold standards. Every telecast became an opportunity to reinforce the mythology of football as a morally upright institution. Audiences learned to associate the sport not only with athletic skill, but with character, virtue, and disciplined professionalism. The impact of televised exposure extended to ownership and executive management. Scandals involving owners, financial disputes, or league policies required carefully scripted statements that reassured both viewers and sponsors. The league understood that televised coverage created immediate accountability in a way print media never could. Yet it also provided a platform to shape perception proactively. Strategic interviews, press conferences, and feature stories were integrated into broadcasts to highlight ethical conduct and organizational competence. Television became both a magnifier of risk and a tool for protection, allowing the league to turn potential crises into demonstrations of oversight and integrity. Television also redefined the stakes of the game itself. The physicality that had once been accepted as part of professional football became a spectacle that audiences experienced as both thrilling and morally significant. Players were elevated to hero status not only for their skill, but for their adherence to conduct expectations. When misbehavior occurred, it was broadcast as a lesson in discipline rather than a failure of character. The league's ability to shape viewer perception in this environment represented a significant evolution in crisis management. Scandals were no longer just internal affairs. They were public tests of the league's credibility and morality. The integration of television into the NFL's identity had long-term consequences. It heightened the value of narrative control and the need for consistency in messaging. As audiences expanded, the league's image had to remain impeccable. Every controversial play, every legal dispute and every injury had to be framed in a manner that preserved trust. Television forced the league to act with transparency while simultaneously exercising discretion. The NFL mastered the art of shaping perception, emphasizing moral authority even as the underlying realities of competitive violence. Labor disputes and ethical ambiguity persisted. Televised games also reinforced the league's cultural significance. Football was no longer merely a sport. It was a shared national experience. Scandals were interpreted not simply as incidents within a game, but as tests of the sport's integrity and societal alignment. The NFL's ability to respond theatrically, to present a narrative of discipline and virtue, strengthened its connection to American identity. Fans learned to trust that the league embodied fairness, courage, and moral clarity, even as they witnessed collisions that could permanently alter lives. Television created a stage on which ethical narratives could be performed with precision and consistency. This period cemented the relationship between exposure and moral storytelling. The league learned that every televised moment could either enhance or undermine credibility. It responded by creating an infrastructure of communication, coordination, and oversight that allowed football to maintain its image of purity despite inevitable crises. The theatrical nature of scandal response became a hallmark of NFL culture, ensuring that audiences received a consistent message regardless of the realities on the field or behind the scenes. Television was not merely a broadcast medium, it became the sanctuary in which the league could simultaneously showcase athleticism, dramatize heroism, and reinforce the mythology of integrity. Television also encouraged the professionalization of internal operations. Rules, policies, and disciplinary measures were refined with the expectation that they would be scrutinized publicly. Every incident required documentation, explanation, and consistent messaging. Players, coaches, and executives were educated in the standards expected of them, knowing that deviations would be visible to millions. The league's response to scandal evolved into a rehearsed performance, aligning behavior with the narrative of moral authority while safeguarding the perception of fairness. In this context, football became inseparable from the image it projected. Television amplified the stakes of every collision, every controversy, and every decision. The NFL demonstrated that careful orchestration could turn potential crises into demonstrations of virtue. The combination of physical spectacle, disciplined oversight, and narrative framing created a new understanding of professional football, a sport that was thrilling, morally coherent, and emblematic of American ideals. Scandals were no longer just threats. They were instruments through which the league reinforced its authority and cultivated loyalty. Television transformed scandal management from reactive to performative. The audience now witnessed not only the incident, but the resolution, creating a sense of transparency while reinforcing the league's moral framework. The NFL learned that the spectacle of crisis, when framed correctly, could strengthen credibility rather than weaken it. The broadcast medium became a tool for ethical storytelling, reinforcing the mythology of discipline, fairness, and virtue that the league had spent decades constructing. The televised NFL became a sanctuary where the sport's physical intensity could coexist with a narrative of moral authority, where scandal could be reframed as accountability, and where the league's image could be carefully curated for millions of Americans. In post-war America, the appetite for heroes was insatiable. Citizens sought symbols of virtue and strength, figures who could embody the ideals of discipline, courage, and moral clarity in a world increasingly complicated by social change. Professional athletes occupied a unique position in this cultural landscape. They were both accessible and aspirational. They represented the possibility of excellence achieved through hard work and self-control. For the National Football League, this cultural moment presented both an opportunity and a challenge. The league could serve as a repository for the nation's desire for heroes, but doing so required careful cultivation. Scandal and human imperfection threatened to disrupt the image of purity that audiences craved. And the NFL recognized that myth could be more powerful than truth. The construction of heroism in football was deliberate. The league emphasized narratives that highlighted personal discipline, resilience, and sacrifice. Stories of players overcoming adversity were amplified. Tales of off-field charity, dedication to family, and adherence to codes of conduct became as important as on-field performance. Football became a moral theater where individual character was as critical as athletic skill. Fans did not simply follow games. They invested in the perceived integrity of the athletes themselves. The public needed heroes who could inspire, not figures whose flaws might undermine faith in the sport or in the values it purported to uphold. This cultural demand shaped league policy and messaging in profound ways. Players who violated norms were disciplined publicly, not simply to enforce rules, but to maintain the moral narrative. Misbehavior became a tool to reinforce standards rather than evidence of systemic weakness. The NFL cultivated an image in which athletes were paragons of virtue, creating a feedback loop in which the audience's expectations and the league's branding reinforced one another. Scandals were reframed as demonstrations of accountability, emphasizing that no individual was above the moral code the league championed. The public rarely learned the full complexity of incidents, but the narrative provided reassurance that football, as an institution, was principled and reliable. The league's emphasis on virtue extended beyond individual athletes to teams and franchises. Organizations were expected to embody the same values that defined players. Owners, coaches, and executives were framed as stewards of character, responsible for maintaining ethical standards and modeling moral behavior. Success on the field was inseparable from adherence to this code. Football was not simply entertainment. It was a cultural touchstone, a platform for projecting ideals of discipline, loyalty, and fairness. Fans, in turn, embraced these narratives, investing in heroes whose reputations had been carefully curated by the league. One illustrative example involved a highly publicized incident in which a star player faced allegations of misconduct. The league's response was swift and orchestrated. The player was disciplined, statements were released emphasizing accountability, and media coverage reinforced the narrative of moral oversight. The focus was not on the scandal itself, but on the demonstration that the NFL upheld its principles. The episode reinforced the perception of integrity, reminding audiences that the league prioritized virtue above individual lapses. Heroism in football, therefore, was as much about the system of accountability as it was about personal achievement. The demand for moral athletes was not arbitrary. Football had become intertwined with American identity, particularly notions of discipline, fairness, and communal responsibility. The league's cultural positioning emphasized that professional sports could reflect the broader social values that Americans sought to celebrate. Players were elevated to moral exemplars because the audience required them to be. In this environment, the truth about human imperfection was subordinate to the power of narrative. Fans did not simply want entertainment. They wanted assurance that the sport represented the values they admired. The NFL provided that assurance, often at the expense of complete transparency. Television magnified this phenomenon. As games and stories were broadcast into homes nationwide, the league gained the capacity to shape perception with precision. Audiences witnessed not only athletic performance, but also the league's responses to controversy, framing both as lessons in character and virtue. Scandals became theatrical demonstrations of oversight and ethical standards, transforming moments of potential disillusionment into opportunities to reinforce trust. In this way, the league cultivated a mythology in which athletes were simultaneously competitors and moral exemplars, visible symbols of the discipline, courage, and ethical clarity that fans demanded. The construction of heroism extended to recruitment and public relations. Players were evaluated not only for athletic ability, but for their perceived character. Those whose conduct or demeanor did not align with the league's moral narrative were rarely elevated to prominent positions. The NFL understood that the image of virtue required careful management at every level. Media guides, Team publications and televised narratives reinforced these expectations, creating an ecosystem in which moral authority and athletic excellence were inseparable. Heroism, in this sense, became a commodity, curated and controlled to satisfy public desire. The league's strategy was remarkably effective. Audiences embraced football not only for its spectacle, but for the heroes it presented. Players were celebrated as role models, teams were admired for discipline, and the NFL as an institution was respected for its perceived ethical standards. Scandals occurred, but they were carefully managed, reframed, and contained. Fans seldom confronted the complexity of human imperfection. Instead, they experienced a consistent narrative in which football exemplified the values America wanted to see reflected in its public figures. The sport's credibility rested on the success of this narrative, and the league invested heavily in ensuring it remained intact. The broader social context reinforced these strategies. In an era marked by political tension, cultural upheaval, and generational change, Americans sought stability and moral clarity in public life. Football offered a space where such clarity could exist, even if it was manufactured. The league's heroes were aspirational figures who reassured audiences that discipline, courage, and ethical conduct remained attainable and valued. In this environment, the tension between reality and myth was deliberately managed, with narrative control and scandal containment serving as tools to maintain public faith. This era also laid the groundwork for modern celebrity culture in professional sports. Athletes were not only competitors, they were symbols, branded through narratives of moral integrity and personal virtue. The public learned to evaluate performance through both athletic skill and adherence to an ethical code. Scandals, when managed effectively, reinforced the mythology of accountability, demonstrating that football could embody national ideals even in moments of imperfection. Heroism became performative as well as substantive, a reflection of the league's careful orchestration of identity, image, and values. By framing athletes as heroes, the league ensured that the public's attention focused on inspiration rather than scrutiny. Fans celebrated triumphs and overlooked flaws, trusting that the institution itself maintained ethical oversight. This dynamic allowed the NFL to navigate crises without losing legitimacy, to maintain audience loyalty even in the face of controversy, and to present a consistent image of moral authority. America needed heroes, and the league provided them, selectively curating reality to meet the cultural demand. The consequences were profound. The NFL became not only a sport, but a cultural institution, defined as much by the morality it projected as the competition it delivered. In retrospect, the league's emphasis on virtue branding illustrates the delicate interplay between audience expectations and institutional control. Football was elevated above its chaotic, violent, and morally complex realities through strategic narrative construction. Scandals, controversies, and imperfections were contained, framed, and performed in ways that reinforced the perception of heroism and integrity. The public rarely encountered the unvarnished truth, but they experienced the consistent moral narrative the league crafted. America needed heroes, and the NFL became the provider of their carefully curated image. Behind the polished uniforms and televised heroics, a hidden epidemic gripped the National Football League. Players endured not only the physical demands of one of the most violent sports in America, but also an environment in which pain was normalized and chemically managed. In the locker rooms, behind closed doors, and even in the homes of some of the most celebrated athletes, the struggle with painkillers, stimulants, and other substances was pervasive. The public narrative, carefully curated by the league, presented professional football as a realm of discipline, toughness, and moral clarity. Privately, many players were fighting battles that were invisible to fans, media, and even their families. From the 1960s through the 1980s, pain management in football existed in a gray zone. Injuries were frequent, often severe, and career-threatening. Knee surgeries, concussions, broken bones, and torn ligaments were part of the game. Players were expected to return quickly, sometimes before injuries were fully healed, and the league tolerated or even encouraged the use of substances that eased the pain. Medical staff administered powerful analgesics, anti-inflammatory drugs, and amphetamines to keep athletes on the field. The league's public statements emphasized toughness, resilience, and professionalism. Behind the scenes, however, players were grappling with addiction, physical deterioration, and the long-term consequences of sustained chemical intervention. The pressures were not solely physical. Players faced immense social expectations to perform at the highest level while maintaining a flawless public image. The NFL's narrative of moral and physical excellence left little room for vulnerability. Admitting to pain, injury, or reliance on substances was perceived as weakness, both by the league and the public. As a result, many athletes concealed their struggles, taking medication in secret, masking injuries, and enduring suffering silently. The league, meanwhile, maintained an image of purity, toughness, and ethical clarity, avoiding any acknowledgement that its stars were human beings subjected to extraordinary physical and emotional strain. One high-profile player from the 1970s later recalled the relentless cycle of treatment and performance. Daily injections of painkillers became routine. Nights were spent trying to sleep while damaged joints throbbed. Weeks of games required continual management of injuries that had never fully healed. The league's protocols provided a framework for immediate recovery and performance, but little attention was paid to long-term health. Publicly, the player was celebrated as a hero, an exemplar of discipline and strength. Privately, he described a life dominated by medication, exhaustion, and the creeping sense that his body was betraying him. Stories like these were far from rare. The hidden epidemic was widespread, affecting players across teams and generations. Stimulants were also part of the landscape. Amphetamines and other performance-enhancing drugs were administered or encouraged to maintain energy, focus, and endurance during grueling schedules. These substances allowed athletes to perform at high levels despite injuries or fatigue, but they carried risks of addiction, psychological strain, and long-term health consequences. The league maintained silence or outright denial, framing performance and discipline as the product of character and training rather than chemical support. Players were left to navigate the tension between physical necessity and ethical expectation, often in isolation. The social culture of football reinforced these patterns. Locker room camaraderie, competitive drive, and the expectation of toughness created an environment where concealment was necessary. Admitting to pain or substance use risked judgment, demotion, or criticism. Players learned to normalize chemical assistance as part of their professional obligations, while the league simultaneously projected an image of ethical and physical purity. Scandals were carefully contained or reframed. Stories of substance misuse rarely reached the public eye unless they threatened the league's credibility or television contracts. Even when incidents emerged, the focus was often on individual responsibility rather than systemic factors, maintaining the narrative of moral and athletic virtue. Medical staff occupied a complex position within this ecosystem. Doctors and trainers were responsible for enabling performance while minimizing long-term harm. Some acted with care, attempting to balance health and career demands. Others were complicit in maintaining the league's image, administering medication to mask injuries and ensure visibility on the field. The tension between ethical medical practice and institutional loyalty created conditions in which players' health was subordinated to the spectacle and reputation of the sport. The league's emphasis on discipline, heroism, and moral clarity allowed these practices to continue largely unchecked, leaving many athletes to bear the hidden cost of performance. This epidemic was not limited to physical pain. The psychological burden was immense. Players contended with stress, anxiety, and the fear of career-ending injuries while under constant scrutiny. The combination of pain, performance pressure, and chemical management created a cycle of dependency, both physical and psychological. The public, however, rarely glimpsed the toll. Narratives of heroism, discipline, and resilience dominated coverage. And the league maintained its image as a bastion of moral and athletic purity. The contrast between reality and perception was stark, revealing the lengths to which the NFL would go to protect its reputation while allowing human suffering to remain invisible. High-profile incidents occasionally forced the league into public acknowledgement. Players hospitalized due to overdose or adverse reactions drew attention to the issue. Investigations into training room practices highlighted systemic challenges, yet the league often minimized these events, framing them as isolated mistakes rather than evidence of a broader pattern. The narrative of purity remained intact. Transparency was selective, disclosure was controlled, and public perception was carefully managed to ensure that fans continued to associate professional football with strength, discipline, and moral clarity rather than chemical dependence and hidden suffering. The consequences of this hidden epidemic were profound. Careers were shortened, bodies were permanently damaged, and mental health crises emerged among retired players. The physical toll extended into the long term as joints deteriorated, neurological conditions developed, and addiction persisted. Yet the league's mythology remained unbroken in the public eye. Television broadcasts, media coverage, and PR efforts emphasized the heroism of athletes and the ethical standards of the league, obscuring the harsh realities of chemical management and physical suffering. Players lived in a dual existence, celebrated publicly as paragons of discipline while privately enduring profound personal costs. The epidemic also illuminated the tension between performance and perception. Fans were accustomed to seeing players as invulnerable, morally upright, and heroic. The league recognized that acknowledging the reality of chemical management or widespread pain could undermine the mythology that had been carefully constructed over decades. Scandals were managed with precision, narratives reframed, and attention redirected to compliance, recovery, or resilience. In this way, the hidden epidemic persisted in the shadows. An uncomfortable truth masked by a carefully curated image of integrity and discipline. By the 1980s, the consequences of these practices became more visible among retired players. Chronic pain, addiction, and neurological disorders were prevalent. Former athletes began to speak out, revealing the hidden costs of the league's emphasis on performance and image. The stories were harrowing. Careers defined by chemical assistance, lives disrupted by dependency, and long-term health consequences that had been invisible during peak performance. Public perception, however, remained largely unchallenged. The mythology of football as a domain of heroic discipline persisted, even as the realities of human suffering emerged slowly and selectively. The hidden epidemic of drugs and painkillers in the NFL illustrates a broader pattern. Scandals and crises were managed not by addressing root causes or transparency, but by framing, containment, and selective disclosure. The league's image of purity and heroism required that human vulnerability be minimized, that chemical dependence be hidden, and that suffering remain invisible. Players endured in silence while the public narrative projected discipline, courage, and ethical clarity. The contrast between reality and perception is central to understanding the NFL's history, revealing a carefully maintained mythology that has shaped both the sport and its cultural resonance. The mythology of professional football depended on heroes, but the human flaws of its stars occasionally collided with the league's carefully constructed narrative. Scandals involving high-profile players threatened to disrupt the image of virtue and discipline that fans had come to expect. When superstars fell from grace, the consequences were not merely personal, they posed a challenge to the credibility of the league itself. The NFL's response followed a consistent pattern: distance the institution from the individual, distract the public with alternative narratives, and reframe the incident in a manner that preserved the perception of integrity. One of the earliest high-profile cases involved a star quarterback whose off-field behavior attracted national attention. Allegations of assault and misconduct surfaced, generating media scrutiny that threatened to overshadow the season. The league faced a dilemma: ignore the issue and risk public outrage, or intervene and risk exposing systemic vulnerability. The chosen strategy emphasized distance. The player was disciplined privately. Public statements were carefully worded to demonstrate accountability. And the narrative shifted to emphasize his on-field achievements and personal rehabilitation. Scandals became contained stories, framed to reassure fans rather than reveal the full complexity of the situation. This approach relied heavily on distraction. Media coverage was guided toward triumphs, personal redemption, and other athletes' accomplishments. Television broadcasts highlighted the excitement of games, the skill of players, and moments of heroism, subtly redirecting attention from controversy. The league understood that a scandalous impact could be mitigated by shaping the conversation around positive narratives. The public rarely received a full account of misconduct, and the mythology of moral authority remained largely intact. Football's heroes could stumble, but the institution itself remained untarnished. Reframing was equally essential. Incidents that could have undermined trust were presented as isolated lapses, emphasizing lessons learned and personal growth. Press conferences, league statements, and selective media appearances worked in concert to reinforce the idea that the NFL maintained oversight and ethical standards. The fallen superstar was portrayed as a cautionary example rather than a reflection of systemic weakness. The message was clear. Football remained a morally sound enterprise, capable of addressing misbehavior while preserving its cultural and ethical authority. Case studies from the 1970s and 1980s illustrate this pattern. Running backs, linebackers, and wide receivers, celebrated for their athletic brilliance, faced allegations ranging from substance abuse to legal troubles. In each instance, the league applied a combination of distance, distraction, and reframing. Players were often fined, suspended, or encouraged to step away temporarily, while the public narrative emphasized responsibility, discipline, and redemption. Media coverage reinforced these narratives, minimizing the appearance of institutional failure. The NFL presented a consistent image. The game remained pure. The league remained principled, and individual misconduct was a solvable problem rather than a reflection of deeper issues. The effectiveness of this strategy relied on the league's control over information channels, television broadcasts, press releases, and cultivated relationships with journalists ensured that coverage aligned with the NFL's preferred framing. Fans received curated accounts emphasizing accountability and moral clarity. Controversial behavior was acknowledged, but context, nuance, and systemic factors were often excluded. The result was a dual reality. Players struggled privately and publicly with consequences, while the league preserved its image of ethical oversight and disciplined professionalism. Superstar scandals also revealed the social dynamics underlying professional football. Fans were deeply invested in the morality of athletes, and deviations from expected behavior generated emotional responses ranging from disappointment to outrage. The league recognized that public trust was fragile and required constant reinforcement. Scandals involving iconic players had the potential to erode this trust, and the institutional response was designed to maintain confidence in both the sport and its ethical standards. By managing perception, the NFL ensured that the hero mythology could endure even when reality presented inconvenient truths. A particularly striking example involved a celebrated wide receiver whose off-field activities drew national scrutiny. Allegations of criminal conduct prompted widespread media attention. The league responded by issuing statements emphasizing compliance with the rules, disciplinary measures, and ongoing oversight. Simultaneously, broadcasts and press narratives shifted toward on-field achievements, charitable contributions, and stories of personal redemption. The strategy minimized reputational damage to the institution while acknowledging individual accountability. Fans remained engaged with the sport, reassured that the league continued to uphold the standards it publicly championed. The pattern of distance, distraction, and reframing was not limited to individual misconduct. Team scandals, conflicts among coaching staff, and disputes with management were also managed with the same principles. The league's message was consistent. Football remained morally upright, competitive integrity was maintained, and ethical standards were enforced. Even when controversies emerged that might have exposed systemic weaknesses, the institutional narrative emphasized correction, accountability, and moral clarity. Public perception of the league's purity was preserved, while the complexities and contradictions of reality remained largely concealed. This approach created a culture in which the public rarely encountered the full consequences of superstar misconduct. Fans witnessed discipline and accountability, but the broader context, substance abuse, mental health struggles, organizational complicity, was rarely disclosed. Players were human, fallible, and vulnerable, but the league's mythos required that they appear heroic. The contrast between perception and reality illustrates the sophisticated mechanisms the NFL developed to protect its image and maintain cultural authority. Heroism was curated, misconduct was contained, and public trust remained intact. The implications extend beyond reputation management. Superstar scandals reveal how institutions balance individual behavior against systemic stability. In professional football, the league's mythology depended on the perceived morality of its stars. When these individuals faltered, strategic communication, media orchestration, and carefully framed disciplinary measures ensured that the institution itself remained credible. Fans were offered lessons in character, redemption, and accountability, reinforcing trust in football as both a sport and a moral exemplar. The league's survival, growth, and cultural influence depended on the success of these strategies. By the end of the 1980s, the pattern was well established. Every high-profile incident was evaluated through the lens of institutional risk and narrative potential. Distance ensured the league was not personally implicated. Distraction shifted public attention to achievement and morality. Reframing turned scandal into opportunity for reinforcement of ethical standards. Players could stumble, the media could report, and fans could respond. But the league's core image remained untarnished. Football retained its position as a symbol of discipline, strength, and moral clarity. The mythology endured, largely because the truth was contained and carefully managed. The era of superstar scandal management illustrates a fundamental principle of professional sports institutions. Perception can be as critical as reality. The NFL's heroes could falter, human frailties could emerge, and incidents could attract national attention. But the institution's credibility relied on its ability to shape and control the narrative. Distance, distraction, and reframing were not merely public relations tactics. They were essential tools for preserving trust, sustaining growth, and reinforcing the mythology of integrity. Fans were offered a consistent story of heroism and virtue, even when the realities behind the headlines were far more complex and troubling. In understanding how the league managed fallen superstars, it becomes clear that professional football was about more than competition. It was about narrative, symbolism, and cultural resonance. Scandals provided both threat and opportunity, challenging the league while allowing it to demonstrate accountability and ethical oversight. Public perception was meticulously maintained, ensuring that heroes could be celebrated, redemption could be highlighted, and the mythology of purity could persist. The NFL learned that human imperfection could be absorbed, contained, and transformed into reinforcement of its own moral and cultural authority. For decades, the National Football League navigated the tension between public image and private realities with precision. Yet some scandals proved difficult to contain. Domestic violence emerged as one of the most challenging and morally complex crises in the league's history. In the early years, allegations against players were often minimized, ignored, or quietly managed behind closed doors. Teams, owners, and league officials frequently prioritized reputation over accountability. The public rarely encountered these cases, and the mythology of moral discipline remained intact. Fans continued to celebrate heroism on the field, unaware that some of their heroes' private actions contradicted the values they were meant to embody. In the 1990s and early 2000s, several incidents began to pierce the veil of invisibility. Stories of assaults, threats, and abuse reached local media, occasionally attracting national attention. Initially, responses were inconsistent. Some players were fined or briefly suspended, while others faced no apparent consequences. The league maintained a narrative of moral oversight, but its credibility was increasingly questioned as patterns emerged. Fans and journalists began asking difficult questions about accountability, ethics, and institutional responsibility. The contrast between public perception and private reality became impossible to ignore. The tension was magnified by the rise of 24-hour news coverage and the proliferation of online media. Allegations could no longer be contained within newspapers or local broadcasts. National audiences became aware of incidents, and public outrage grew. The league faced the stark choice between continuing to minimize the issue or addressing it with transparency and systemic reform. Early reluctance to confront domestic violence reflected broader societal tendencies to silence victims, protect institutions, and prioritize reputations over human well-being. Football, as a highly visible cultural institution, was forced into a reckoning that revealed both ethical failures and the need for policy evolution. One illustrative case involved a prominent linebacker whose off-field behavior sparked widespread condemnation. Initial reports were met with muted responses from team officials. Internal investigations were conducted quietly, and public statements emphasized the player's remorse and on-field contributions rather than the severity of the incident. Fans and advocacy groups protested, highlighting the disconnect between the league's public messaging and private reality. The sustained pressure prompted the NFL to develop formal policies addressing domestic violence, disciplinary procedures, and player conduct guidelines. The crisis forced the institution to reconcile its image of moral authority with the undeniable reality of human imperfection. This period marked a shift in the league's approach. The mythology of purity could no longer rely solely on narrative control, distraction, or selective disclosure. Domestic violence demanded systemic attention. Policies were established, penalties were clarified, and educational programs were implemented. The NFL began emphasizing accountability not only for individual players, but for the organization as a whole. The crisis demonstrated that the league's image could no longer be maintained purely through performance, spectacle, or heroic storytelling. Ethical credibility required structural response and transparency. The impact extended beyond individual cases. Domestic violence scandals highlighted broader institutional patterns and cultural challenges within professional football. The emphasis on toughness, aggression, and competitiveness sometimes conflicted with behavioral expectations off the field. The league's response was complicated by loyalty to teams' financial considerations, and a desire to maintain television contracts and fan support. Navigating these competing priorities required careful management. Yet the crisis also created an opportunity to demonstrate moral and organizational evolution. The league learned that accountability, policy, and public transparency were essential to sustaining both cultural authority and institutional legitimacy. The evolution of policy reflected both moral and practical considerations. Penalties for misconduct became standardized. Educational programs for players were expanded, and league officials emphasized the importance of ethical conduct. Media coverage shifted to acknowledge both incidents and responses, creating a new public framework in which domestic violence could be addressed systematically rather than treated as isolated anomalies. Fans began to recognize that heroism on the field did not exempt players from moral responsibility off it. The league's mythology of discipline and integrity was tested, and it responded by institutionalizing reforms that had previously been absent. The crisis also revealed tensions between perception and reality. Fans, sponsors, and media had long embraced narratives of heroism, discipline, and moral clarity, often overlooking or excusing private misconduct. Domestic violence scandals disrupted this equilibrium, forcing the league to confront uncomfortable truths. The mythology of purity required redefinition. Heroism was no longer measured solely by performance, toughness, or public persona. Ethical conduct, accountability, and responsiveness became integral to the narrative of professional football. The league's public image evolved to reflect these new expectations, even as challenges persisted. The institutional response was deliberate and multifaceted. Players facing allegations were subject to formal investigations and disciplinary action. Teams were instructed to implement preventive and educational measures. Public statements emphasized accountability, responsibility, and alignment with league values. The message was consistent. Professional football could maintain its cultural authority only by demonstrating ethical oversight, enforcing standards, and addressing misconduct transparently. Fans witnessed a new era in which reputation and morality were inseparable from athletic excellence. Despite progress, tension remained. The league had to balance the need for public accountability with legal considerations, media scrutiny, and player advocacy. Some cases remained contested or legally unresolved, yet the overarching principle was clear. The institution could not ignore or conceal behavior that contradicted its moral narrative. Domestic violence became a defining issue, illustrating the limits of mythology and the necessity of concrete policies to sustain credibility. The NFL's identity as a morally disciplined and culturally authoritative institution required more than storytelling. It demanded action. The crisis also influenced cultural expectations of professional athletes. Fans began to evaluate players not only for their athletic skill, but for their ethical behavior. The mythology of heroism expanded to encompass personal conduct, social responsibility, and adherence to standards that reflected societal values. Scandals that had once been silenced or reframed were now addressed publicly, with consequences and institutional oversight. Football became a lens through which audiences assessed not just performance, but character, reinforcing the connection between ethics and public admiration. By the early 2010s, the league had implemented comprehensive programs addressing domestic violence, substance abuse, and player conduct. The process reflected decades of accumulated experience in managing scandal, shaping perception, and maintaining cultural authority. The mythology of purity remained central, but it now incorporated the understanding that human imperfection required institutional response. The NFL's evolution demonstrated that moral authority is both performative and structural, relying on narrative, policy, and consistent enforcement to maintain credibility. The league's reckoning with domestic violence underscores the tension between myth and reality. For years, the public celebrated football heroes while private misconduct was minimized or concealed. When these incidents could no longer be ignored, the NFL faced a choice: preserve appearance at the expense of ethics, or embrace transparency and reform. The institution chose the latter, establishing policies, disciplinary measures, and educational programs that redefined expectations for players, teams, and the league itself. The episode illustrates how professional sports must negotiate public trust, ethical responsibility, and institutional survival in the face of crises that challenge mythology and perception. Domestic violence scandals remain a crucial chapter in the history of professional football. They demonstrate the limits of narrative control, the consequences of concealment, and the need for systemic accountability. The league's response reflects both moral and pragmatic imperatives. Ethical oversight is essential for credibility, public confidence, and cultural influence. Professional football's mythology of heroism and purity evolved in response to this crisis, illustrating the dynamic interplay between scandal, institutional policy, and cultural expectation. The NFL's reckoning with domestic violence was not merely a response to individual misconduct. It was a pivotal moment in the ongoing construction of its public identity. The National Football League's reputation for discipline, integrity, and heroism has always rested on the careful management of both perception and information. Beneath the polished broadcasts, the orchestrated celebrations, and the curated narratives, there existed a shadow network of institutional protection. Crimes committed by players, executives, and even minor staff were sometimes quietly managed to prevent public exposure. Records were erased, suspensions were imposed behind closed doors, and incidents were minimized to maintain the perception of moral clarity. The shield of the league operated as both protector and concealer, preserving the institution's image while leaving human consequences largely hidden. Cover-ups began early in the league's history. Instances of assault, financial misconduct, and violations of league rules were often addressed internally with the understanding that public disclosure could threaten fan confidence, television contracts, and sponsorship agreements. Teams were encouraged to handle matters discreetly. In some cases, players faced fines or temporary suspension, but the records of these actions were seldom made public. The shield extended beyond procedural concealment. It shaped media coverage, guided investigative reporting, and influenced legal processes to ensure minimal disruption to the league's narrative of integrity. The mechanisms of concealment were sophisticated. League offices monitored reports from local law enforcement, conducted internal investigations, and coordinated with media contacts to control the flow of information. Players implicated in criminal activity were sometimes relocated between teams, quietly fined, or encouraged to resign rather than face public scrutiny. These practices allowed the league to maintain an unbroken façade of virtue while absorbing misconduct internally. Fans and casual observers saw discipline and heroism, but rarely the full spectrum of wrongdoing that occurred behind the scenes. One striking example involved a player whose financial and personal misconduct was quietly resolved through internal arbitration. Allegations of fraud and coercion were investigated by league officials, but the results were never fully disclosed to the public. The player returned to competition without fan awareness of the incident. Statements from team executives emphasized character development, professionalism, and rehabilitation, framing the resolution as a reaffirmation of both individual and institutional morality. In reality, the episode revealed the league's willingness to prioritize its shield over transparency, ensuring that the public narrative of purity remained intact. Quiet suspensions were another element of the protective framework. Players who committed offenses were sometimes required to serve time away from the team. But the nature of the offense and the length of suspension were carefully controlled to minimize public attention. Press statements were vague, emphasizing the league's commitment to discipline without disclosing specifics. This approach allowed the institution to address misconduct internally while maintaining the perception of ethical consistency. The shield operated in silence, enforcing accountability selectively and strategically. The erasure of records served a complementary purpose. Documentation of infractions, legal cases, or league investigations could compromise the mythology of integrity if revealed. Administrators routinely controlled access to historical records, ensuring that problematic incidents were excluded from public archives. Statistical histories, team rosters, and media guides were curated to minimize evidence of misconduct, reinforcing the perception that the league had always been morally disciplined. Fans and historians alike encountered a narrative that emphasized heroism, discipline, and competitive purity, while the shadow reality of human misbehavior remained largely invisible. This protective system extended beyond players to encompass owners, coaches, and executives. Allegations of financial impropriety, intimidation, and abuse were sometimes managed discreetly to prevent institutional embarrassment. The shield was both a cultural and operational phenomenon, rooted in the belief that public trust in the league outweighed the imperative of transparency. Decisions were calculated, interventions were strategic, and the maintenance of reputation became a core function of the NFL's administrative apparatus. In many cases, institutional survival depended on the shield's discretion. The consequences for those affected by these hidden crimes were often severe. Victims received minimal support or recognition, and perpetrators sometimes returned to prominence with little accountability. Players navigating the dual reality of public adoration and private misdeeds faced personal and professional complexity, while fans remained largely unaware of the human cost. The shield protected the league at the expense of full ethical clarity, demonstrating the tension between cultural mythology and the realities of power, misconduct, and accountability. The strategic management of hidden crimes reflects broader societal dynamics. Professional football is embedded within American culture as a site of heroism, competition, and moral aspiration. Maintaining this image requires selective disclosure, narrative control, and institutional protection. Cover-ups, quiet suspensions, and erased records are not merely administrative acts. They are cultural mechanisms designed to preserve public trust, fan loyalty, and commercial viability. The NFL's mythology relies on the careful calibration of perception. And the shield functions as both instrument and symbol of that calibration. High-profile incidents occasionally brought these practices into public view. Investigations by journalists, whistleblowers, and former players revealed patterns of concealment that had long been hidden. These revelations prompted criticism, policy reforms, and internal reflection. Yet the underlying principle remained consistent. The league's cultural authority was protected by the shield, even when transparency and accountability were incomplete. Fans learned that the narrative of purity was constructed as much by omission as by performance, and that heroism existed alongside human fallibility that was carefully managed behind the scenes. The shield also reveals the sophisticated nature of organizational risk management. The league recognized that a single scandal could have cascading effects on public perception, television contracts, and sponsorships. By containing information, the NFL minimized exposure, allowing incidents to be absorbed internally without compromising the broader mythology of integrity. Quiet suspensions, erasure of records, and controlled narratives were not acts of denial, but strategic interventions to maintain continuity, cultural legitimacy, and commercial viability. The shield served as both a protective mechanism and a performance of ethical oversight. These strategies shaped the expectations and experiences of players. Understanding the existence of the shield altered behavior, incentives, and perceptions of accountability. Some players internalized the dual reality, performing heroism publicly while navigating permissive environments privately. Others were emboldened, believing the institution would protect them from full consequence. In all cases, the shield functioned as a defining element of professional football's culture, shaping behavior, narrative, and perception across generations. The broader implication is clear. The NFL's mythology of purity and discipline has always been maintained through calculated management of human imperfection. Hidden crimes, when addressed internally, allow the institution to project continuity, heroism, and ethical authority. The shield protects not only the league's reputation, but also the cultural and commercial ecosystems that depend upon it. Fans experience an unbroken narrative of virtue, performance, and integrity, even when reality is far more complex, revealing the duality at the heart of professional football's public image. Understanding hidden crimes and the mechanisms of institutional protection provides critical insight into the league's approach to scandal, distance, distraction, and reframing techniques applied to superstars intersect with the shield's operational control, forming a comprehensive system that preserves mythology while navigating human imperfection. The NFL's history of concealment, quiet discipline, and record management underscores the sophisticated orchestration required to maintain the appearance of moral and ethical consistency across decades of complex events. The shield, therefore, is both a protective and performative structure. It enforces selective accountability while maintaining public trust. It shapes perception while influencing behavior. It reconciles institutional survival with the realities of misconduct, providing a buffer between public myth and private reality. Hidden crimes exist alongside public celebration, illustrating the duality that defines professional football. A culture of heroism, discipline, and virtue sustained by strategic discretion and institutional protection. Professional football is a collision sport unlike any other, a theater of controlled violence in which the human body is both instrument and casualty. For decades, the National Football League promoted an image of toughness, heroism, and moral clarity, celebrating players who could endure the most punishing physical encounters and emerge victorious. Beneath this mythology, however, a silent epidemic was growing. Concussions, repetitive head trauma, and the long-term neurological consequences of repeated hits were pervasive realities for players. Yet the league publicly minimized the issue for decades. Purity messaging, carefully constructed through decades of public relations and narrative control, disguised a crisis that would eventually threaten the NFL's credibility and cultural authority. In the early years of professional football, concussions were considered part of the game. Trainers, coaches, and medical staff often described symptoms as illness, confusion, nausea, and memory loss as temporary inconveniences. Players were expected to shake off blows to the head and return to play quickly, embodying the league's ethos of toughness and resilience. At the time, medical understanding of brain injury was limited, but the culture surrounding football amplified the consequences. Players internalized the expectation that enduring pain, including neurological trauma, was a measure of character. This normalized a pattern of repeated head injuries and suppressed discussion of their long-term effects. As scientific research advanced in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the extent of brain trauma in football became increasingly clear. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, emerged as a recognizable condition linked to repeated concussions and subconcussive hits. Former players began to report symptoms: memory lapses, depression, mood swings, and cognitive decline. Families described dramatic changes in behavior, personality, and decision-making. Despite mounting evidence, the league maintained a careful narrative emphasizing responsibility, heroism, and medical oversight. The mythology of purity and toughness remained central, and any acknowledgement of widespread neurological risk was carefully framed to protect the league's image. Public attention began to rise as investigative reporting exposed internal documents, studies, and correspondence revealing that the league had been aware of the risks associated with repeated head trauma for decades. Research conducted in the 1980s and 1990s indicated the connection between repeated concussions and long-term neurological disorders. Rather than fully disclose these findings, the league engaged in selective acknowledgement, emphasizing player education and safety initiatives while downplaying or questioning the validity of emerging research. The tension between scientific truth and public image exemplified the broader strategy the NFL had relied upon in previous crises. Maintain cultural authority by controlling narrative while absorbing the human and ethical cost privately. Players' experiences illuminate the human consequences of this approach. Veterans of the sport describe careers defined by repeated concussions, treatment with painkillers, and relentless pressure to return to the field. Some players concealed symptoms to avoid demotion, criticism, or being sidelined, while others experienced early-onset dementia, depression, and personality changes in retirement. Families witnessed transformations that were incomprehensible within the mythology of heroism that the league promoted. The contrast between public celebration and private suffering highlighted the ethical tension at the heart of professional football, revealing how institutional imperatives could overshadow individual well-being. Purity messaging played a critical role in concealing the crisis. Public statements, television coverage, and league initiatives emphasized commitment to safety, ethics, and moral responsibility. Headlines celebrated advancements in concussion protocols, improved equipment, and educational programs, creating the impression that the league was proactively safeguarding players. The narrative of discipline, toughness, and moral authority remained intact, even as scientific and anecdotal evidence indicated that the problem was systemic, persistent, and underestimated. Fans encountered the myth of progress while the underlying crisis continued, largely unchecked. The league's approach to crisis management reflected lessons learned from prior scandals. Distance, distraction, and reframing were applied in a new context. Internal research and knowledge of concussion risks were treated as proprietary information, contained within medical and administrative offices. Public statements emphasized education, responsibility, and cooperation with players, subtly framing the issue as manageable rather than existential. The mythology of purity and heroism allowed fans to continue celebrating athletes without confronting the realities of gauges. About to my cages, of cages essential. I'll see my essential, stability, century. I'll see my century. By it, my century. The wide to be oxide, my associate, by my myth, by my ass. By weight of you, kidded. My lead a love you say clap be a cat. It Ives like kid, it's I use lie, it's kicks to sit it, side to it, I got it, it, beaks to its gets just squeak guide hips. These persist comic it of Alice pathetic pacific by Ellie. The basis that's the neurological risk. The contradiction between perception and truth became one of the defining ethical challenges of modern professional football. High-profile cases, including the posthumous diagnoses of CTE in prominent players, intensified scrutiny. Families, medical researchers, and journalists demanded accountability, exposing the gap between public messaging and institutional knowledge. Lawsuits and settlements brought the issue to national attention, challenging the league's ability to maintain the mythology of safety and ethical oversight. For decades, the shield of controlled narrative had protected the league from reputation damage. But the convergence of science, media, and human testimony created a moment in which mythology and reality collided. The cultural consequences of this era were significant. Fans and media were forced to reconsider the assumptions that underpinned football's mythology. Heroism and toughness were no longer unqualified virtues if they masked long-term harm. Ethical authority required acknowledgement of systemic failure and commitment to reform. The league, previously accustomed to managing scandal through concealment and narrative control, faced a crisis that demanded transparency, policy reform, and cultural adaptation. The mythology of purity had to be reconciled with the undeniable evidence of human suffering and institutional responsibility. The response to the concussion crisis reflected both continuity and evolution. The league introduced enhanced concussion protocols, independent neurological evaluation, and awareness campaigns. Teams were instructed to prioritize player safety, and equipment standards were revised. At the same time, the NFL continued to emphasize heroism, ethical conduct, and competitive discipline, framing new policies as enhancements rather than acknowledgments of past failure. Fans were presented with the impression of progress and responsibility, maintaining the mythology of purity, even as the league navigated one of its most profound ethical challenges. This era illustrates the fundamental tension between institutional image and human reality in professional football. The mythology of moral and physical purity, cultivated over decades, collided with scientific evidence and lived experience. The league's careful management of perception preserved cultural authority. But the underlying crisis revealed the ethical and human cost of maintaining an unbroken narrative of heroism. Concussions, once invisible or minimized, became emblematic of the limits of narrative control and the necessity of transparency in the modern era. Ultimately, the concussion era is not merely a story of medical science or institutional policy. It is a story about trust, mythology, and the limits of perception. Fans were invited to celebrate athletes as paragons of virtue, while players navigated a world in which the consequences of repeated trauma were largely concealed. The league's commitment to purity and heroism was tested against scientific truth and human experience, revealing the profound complexity of managing image in a collision sport that exacts immense physical and psychological cost. The tension between truth and image, between mythology and reality, defines this chapter in professional football history and illuminates the ethical challenges that continue to shape the league. Throughout its history, the National Football League has mastered the art of transforming crises into opportunities for reinforcement, adaptation, and public reassurance. Scandal, rather than merely threatening the institution, became a mechanism through which the league could reassert control. renew public trust, and rebrand itself in ways that aligned with evolving cultural expectations. The idea was simple, but profound. Every publicized failure was not only a challenge, but also a chance to demonstrate moral oversight, ethical evolution, and institutional authority. By converting scandal into rebranding fuel, the NFL cultivated a mythology in which resilience, virtue, and responsibility were celebrated alongside athletic excellence. Early examples of this strategy can be traced back to the league's response to gambling scandals in the 1920s. When players or team officials were implicated in fixing games, the league's immediate imperative was to stabilize its credibility. Discipline, public statements of integrity, and narrative framing transformed potential catastrophe into a demonstration of ethical oversight. Fans witnessed swift action, learned lessons about responsibility and honesty, and were reassured that football was a morally coherent enterprise. What might have been a purely destructive event was repurposed to reinforce the mythology of moral authority. The same principle applied as the NFL matured, and it would become central to modern crisis management strategies. In more recent decades, the NFL has demonstrated remarkable proficiency in this approach. When high-profile domestic violence cases emerged, the league responded not merely with punitive measures, but with public education campaigns, revised conduct, policies, and visibility for rehabilitation initiatives. Scandal became the catalyst for demonstrating ethical evolution. Media narratives emphasized accountability, transparency, and the institution's commitment to safeguarding both players and fans. The mythology of purity, previously tested, was not only preserved but expanded to include responsiveness, social awareness, and ethical reform. Crisis was reframed as evidence of the league's ability to uphold its values under pressure. The concussion era exemplifies this strategy on a modern and highly visible scale. For decades, head injuries were minimized. Research selectively disclosed, and the public reassured that the game was safe. When the crisis became undeniable, the league responded strategically. Concussion protocols were implemented. Independent neurological oversight was introduced, and media campaigns highlighted the institution's commitment to player welfare. Rather than allowing public perception to focus on past negligence, the narrative emphasized proactive reform, moral responsibility, and technical advancement. Scandal became a vehicle for demonstrating the NFL's capacity to evolve while maintaining its mythology of ethical oversight. The pattern of turning scandal into rebranding fuel relies on several consistent mechanisms. First, distance is maintained between the institution and the individual responsible for misconduct. Public focus shifts to policy, education, and institutional commitment rather than the personal failings of players or staff. Second, distraction emphasizes positive narratives that reinforce fan engagement, including athletic achievement, charitable activity, or community outreach. Third, reframing presents the scandal not as a failure, but as a demonstration of ethical vigilance, accountability, and moral learning. Together, these strategies allow the league to harness controversy in ways that strengthen, rather than weaken, its cultural authority. A modern example involves financial misconduct and off-field controversies among executives. When allegations surface, the league often responds with internal investigation, temporary suspensions, and public statements emphasizing transparency. Rather than eroding trust, these episodes are reframed as evidence of the NFL's ethical standards, procedural rigor, and commitment to maintaining fairness. Fans and sponsors receive a narrative that suggests that problems are addressed decisively and effectively. Scandal is not ignored, but transformed into a testament to the institution's resilience and authority. Similarly, high-profile cases of player misconduct or personal failure are frequently leveraged to showcase rehabilitation, community service, and personal growth. The league highlights compliance programs, mentoring initiatives, and partnerships with social organizations, emphasizing how challenges can catalyze positive change. By integrating scandal into the broader narrative of growth and accountability, the NFL ensures that its mythology of moral oversight is continually reinforced. Fans perceive an organization capable of ethical leadership, even amid adversity. Scandal, in this sense, becomes a tool for narrative refinement rather than a source of systemic weakness. The strategic use of scandal as rebranding fuel is enhanced by the league. As control over media and communication channels. Carefully crafted statements, coordinated press releases, and partnerships with journalists create a curated narrative. Coverage of misconduct emphasizes corrective action, education, and moral reflection, subtly shifting public attention from the failure itself to the league's response. Television broadcasts, social media campaigns, and public relations efforts work in concert to present a coherent story. Football remains morally disciplined. The institution is accountable, and heroism is preserved even as human fallibility is acknowledged. The effectiveness of this strategy relies on the interplay between culture and perception. Fans invest not only in athletic performance, but in the mythology of discipline, virtue, and resilience. By framing scandals as opportunities for reasserting ethical authority, the NFL meets these expectations. The institution demonstrates that it is capable of learning, adapting, and safeguarding its values. Public confidence is reinforced, heroism remains aspirational, and the narrative of purity continues to resonate. Scandal ceases to be merely a threat, becomes a tool for institutional reaffirmation and audience reassurance. Over time, this approach has become embedded in the league's organizational culture. Executives, public relations teams, and medical advisors are attuned to the dual imperative of managing human reality and preserving institutional mythology. Every crisis is assessed for its narrative potential as well as its ethical implications. Responses are calibrated to balance transparency, accountability, and image enhancement. Fans experience consistency in messaging. The media receives structured narratives, and the institution maintains cultural authority even as individual players, executives, or events test its resilience. This pattern underscores a broader principle. The mythology of purity in professional football is dynamic, adaptive, and strategically reinforced. Scandal, once a threat to moral and cultural authority, is transformed into evidence of ethical capacity, institutional strength, and responsiveness. By managing distance, distraction, and reframing in modern contexts, the league converts challenges into opportunities for narrative refinement. The mythology of integrity is not static. It evolves through engagement with crisis, drawing strength from the very controversies that might otherwise undermine it. Ultimately, scandal as rebranding fuel illustrates the sophistication of the NFL's approach to culture, ethics, and audience perception. The institution has learned to navigate the tension between human imperfection and public expectation. It transforms exposure into opportunity, failure into demonstration of vigilance, and controversy into reaffirmation of authority. Through this approach, the league preserves the mythology of purity, sustains fan engagement, and maintains its position as a cultural and ethical exemplar within American sports. Scandal is no longer merely a liability. It is a mechanism for renewal, reinforcement, and reassertion of institutional mythology. In the evolution of the National Football League, one of the most consequential shifts occurred not on the field, but in policy and governance. The establishment of personal conduct rules marked a deliberate effort to codify morality, discipline, and ethical oversight into the very framework of the league. These rules were designed to regulate player behavior, shape public perception, and ensure that the mythology of purity was maintained, even in the face of human imperfection. The rise of personal conduct policies reflects the league's understanding that morality could be engineered, managed, and projected as part of its institutional identity. Personal conduct rules emerged in response to a series of crises that exposed vulnerabilities in the league's image. High-profile cases of domestic violence, substance abuse, and off-field misconduct demonstrated the limits of narrative control alone. Fans and media demanded accountability. Legal authorities scrutinized the league's responses, and sponsors became increasingly sensitive to ethical perception. The NFL recognized that reputation management required formal mechanisms rather than ad hoc measures. By codifying expectations, the league could enforce discipline consistently, project ethical authority, and mitigate the reputational damage that scandals had historically inflicted. The scope of personal conduct rules was intentionally broad. They encompassed criminal behavior, violent conduct, substance abuse, and actions that could bring the league into disrepute. The policies were framed not only as disciplinary tools, but as instruments of ethical leadership, reinforcing the mythology of the NFL as an institution capable of instilling moral responsibility. Violations triggered investigations, suspensions, fines, and educational requirements, all intended to signal to the public that professional football maintained high standards of personal and professional conduct. The rules were both a response to individual behavior and a reinforcement of institutional narrative. Despite the ostensible focus on ethics, the rules were often constructed with optics in mind. Public statements emphasized fairness, accountability, and consistency, yet the policies were also carefully calibrated to protect the league's image. The timing of suspensions, the framing of public announcements, and the coordination with media coverage ensured that the institution retained control over narrative outcomes. In essence, personal conduct rules functioned as a dual mechanism. They enforced behavior among players while simultaneously shaping public perception of the NFL as a morally disciplined organization. One notable case illustrates this dual function. A player involved in a high-profile domestic incident was suspended under the personal conduct policy. The league's public statement emphasized accountability, education, and alignment with league values. Internally, the player underwent rehabilitation programs, counseling, and monitoring. The public saw a decisive response that reinforced the mythology of integrity. Behind the scenes, the league controlled information, shaped media framing, and ensured that the narrative reinforced institutional authority. The incident demonstrated how personal conduct rules could serve both practical and symbolic purposes, regulating behavior while projecting ethical control. The development of these policies reflected lessons learned from decades of scandal management. Early crises had been addressed through concealment, distance, and narrative control. But evolving media landscapes and cultural expectations demanded a more formalized approach. The rise of 24-hour news, social media scrutiny, and investigative reporting meant that concealment alone was insufficient. The NFL recognized that codifying morality into governance allowed for proactive management of risk, standardized enforcement, and a reinforced mythology of purity that could withstand public scrutiny. These policies also reinforced the cultural expectations of professional athletes. Players were not simply judged by their on-field performance, but by their adherence to behavioral standards that reflected societal norms, institutional values, and moral virtue. Heroism became inseparable from ethical conduct. The mythology of purity, once centered on discipline, patriotism, and resilience, expanded to include compliance with codified moral expectations. Players were expected to embody the league's values both publicly and privately, and the personal conduct rules provided a framework for assessing and shaping this behavior. Critics, however, have argued that the rules were as much about appearance as ethics. Enforcement was inconsistent with variations based on public visibility, player status, and media attention. The timing and severity of discipline were sometimes influenced by considerations of reputation management rather than purely ethical judgment. In this sense, personal conduct policies were as much instruments of public relations as instruments of moral governance. They ensured that the mythology of integrity could be maintained even as human fallibility persisted. The optics of discipline became nearly as important as the discipline itself. The institutional emphasis on optics illustrates a fundamental aspect of professional football's governance. The league functions not only as a competitive sport, but as a cultural institution whose authority is tied to perception. Personal conduct rules formalize the ethical expectations of players, while simultaneously providing a mechanism for shaping public understanding. Compliance signals moral legitimacy, transparency, and responsiveness. Even as individual incidents reveal human imperfection, the existence and enforcement of these policies reinforce the narrative that professional football embodies discipline, integrity, and ethical oversight. Education and rehabilitation became integral components of the policy framework. Players subject to disciplinary action were often required to attend programs addressing behavioral issues, substance abuse, or personal conduct. These initiatives served a dual purpose. They demonstrated the league's commitment to player development and moral guidance. And they reinforced the perception that the NFL was actively cultivating a culture of responsibility. Scandal could now be reframed as a demonstration of the league's ability to enforce, educate, and transform. Ethical authority was projected through both consequence and corrective guidance. The rise of personal conduct rules also represents the institutionalization of lessons learned from prior scandals. Incidents that had once been concealed or minimized were now addressed through a formalized, standardized framework that balanced accountability with narrative control. Fans were presented with a consistent story. Misconduct is unacceptable. Violations are disciplined, and the league upholds ethical standards. The mythology of purity was no longer vulnerable to random exposure or uneven management. It was codified, enforceable, and strategically communicated to the public. In practice, these rules underscore the interplay between morality and perception in professional football. The league's authority derives not only from athletic spectacle, but from cultural legitimacy. By embedding ethical expectations into governance, the NFL reinforces the mythology of heroism, discipline, and integrity. Players are guided, constrained, and evaluated by these standards. Fans receive narratives that align with moral expectations. Scandal is absorbed, disciplined, and reframed in ways that enhance, rather than diminish, institutional credibility. Personal conduct rules function as both regulatory mechanism and narrative instrument, ensuring that professional football remains morally coherent in the public eye. Ultimately, the rise of personal conduct rules reflects the NFL's sophisticated understanding of culture, ethics, and image management. Scandals, misconduct, and human imperfection are inevitable in any high-profile institution. The league's response, however, is calculated to ensure that public mythology remains intact. By codifying morality into governance, projecting ethical oversight, and emphasizing both compliance and optics, the NFL maintains its authority, preserves fan trust, and reinforces the narrative that professional football is a morally disciplined institution. The rules represent both practical enforcement and symbolic affirmation of the mythology that has long defined the sport. In the landscape of professional football, the intersection of sport, culture, and national identity has always been central to the league's mythology. For decades, the National Football League cultivated an image of moral clarity, discipline, and heroism, as scandals and controversies challenged this mythology in the modern era. The league increasingly relied on the symbolic power of patriotism to restore equilibrium and reinforce cultural authority. The national anthem, once a ceremonial prelude to games, became a stage for projecting loyalty, unity, and virtue, functioning as a deliberate instrument to cleanse brand tension and reaffirm the NFL's position within American life. The rise of the national anthem era coincided with heightened social and political scrutiny. Players, coaches, and executives were under intense public observation. Off-field controversies, domestic violence cases, and concussion revelations threatened the mythology of heroism and discipline that the league had cultivated for decades. In response, patriotism emerged as a unifying narrative, one that could redirect attention, reinforce loyalty, and present the league as an institution aligned with national values. Through the act of standing, honoring the flag, and invoking collective identity, the NFL projected an image of moral rectitude that counterbalanced challenges to its purity. Historically, football had always been intertwined with American identity. During wartime, games were framed as displays of endurance, discipline, and national spirit. military service by players and patriotic ceremonies were highlighted to demonstrate alignment between athletic valor and civic virtue. By the 21st century, the league's cultural authority relied on a similar symbolic framework. The national anthem, media coverage of patriotic observances, and public messaging around civic duty allowed the NFL to reaffirm connections between heroism on the field and moral alignment off it. Patriotism became a tool for narrative control as much as a reflection of national culture. The league's strategy was multi-layered. Anthem ceremonies, televised nationwide, provided a visual and cultural reaffirmation of values. Fan participation, media commentary, and official statements emphasized unity, respect, and ethical grounding. When off-field controversies emerged, these displays of patriotism functioned as a symbolic buffer, framing the institution as a defender of national ideals. The mythology of purity, once threatened by scandal or social criticism, was reinforced through ritualized acts that combined emotion, symbolism, and public visibility. Patriotism became a mechanism for both cultural cohesion and institutional protection. Players' participation in these ceremonies also reflected the duality of individual expression and institutional expectation. On one hand, athletes were celebrated for embodying discipline, patriotism, and heroism. On the other hand, deviations from expected behavior, whether political protests or expressions of personal dissent, were framed as threats to both cultural narrative and institutional authority. The league's responses, which included public statements, fines, and media coordination, underscored the tension between personal freedom and the mythology of collective virtue. Anthem observances were not only ceremonial, but regulatory, reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable behavior within the league's moral and cultural framework. The symbolism extended beyond the stadium. Media coverage amplified patriotic messaging, emphasizing players' respect for national institutions and the ceremonial solemnity of the moment. Social media discourse, public commentary, and corporate partnerships reinforced the narrative, embedding the NFL's identity within a larger cultural ethos. Controversies surrounding the anthem, protests, or perceived deviations were often reframed as threats to national unity, allowing the league to present both discipline and morality as aligned with American values. Patriotism became both an ethical signal and a strategic tool for brand management. The effectiveness of this strategy lies in its psychological and cultural resonance. Fans are invested not only in athletic competition, but in symbolic affirmation of shared values. By emphasizing patriotism and ritualized expression, the league harnessed cultural emotion to manage perception. Scandals that might otherwise have eroded trust were mitigated through the projection of national loyalty, heroism, and ethical alignment. The mythology of purity remained intact because the narrative emphasized collective values rather than individual transgressions. Anthem ceremonies functioned as an emotional and symbolic shield, reinforcing institutional authority in ways that transcended athletic performance. At the same time, the national anthem era exposed tensions inherent in the league's mythology. Player protests, social movements, and individual expression challenged the league's ability to maintain a unified cultural narrative. Public debate over the appropriateness of kneeling, raising fists, or remaining seated highlighted the complex interplay between morality, patriotism, and institutional control. The NFL's responses, fines, policy statements, and media framing reflected the ongoing balancing act between protecting the mythology of heroism and adapting to a socially evolving landscape. The symbolism of patriotism became both a tool and a site of conflict, illustrating the difficulty of maintaining narrative purity amid diverse societal expectations. Corporate and commercial considerations reinforced the significance of patriotic symbolism. Sponsors, broadcasters, and advertisers invested in the narrative of loyalty, unity, and moral alignment. Public controversies could affect revenue, viewership, and brand partnerships. By centering patriotism in public observance, the league created a buffer against both reputational and financial risk. Anthem ceremonies became more than symbolic gestures. They were strategic interventions, carefully curated to sustain institutional legitimacy, cultural authority, and commercial stability. Patriotism served the dual purpose of ethical messaging and brand protection. The national anthem era also illustrates the adaptive capacity of the league's mythology. Just as earlier scandals were transformed into opportunities for ethical reaffirmation, controversies surrounding social expression and civic symbolism were absorbed into the broader narrative of institutional authority. The mythology of purity, moral discipline, and heroism evolved to include public ritual, national loyalty, and collective identification. Fans encountered a coherent story in which athletic excellence, ethical oversight, and patriotic affirmation converged, reinforcing the NFL's position as both a sporting and cultural institution. Ultimately, the league's reliance on patriotism demonstrates the interplay between social perception, institutional strategy, and mythology. The national anthem era provided a mechanism for reconciling cultural tension, managing scandal, and projecting ethical authority. It reinforced the narrative of heroism and moral clarity, while simultaneously adapting to new forms of scrutiny, activism, and social engagement. Patriotism became both a symbolic and strategic tool, enabling the NFL to maintain its mythology of purity even as contemporary challenges tested the limits of narrative control. The national anthem era is therefore emblematic of the broader strategies the league has employed for decades. Symbolism, ritual, and narrative management work together to maintain the mythology of integrity and virtue. Fans are invited to celebrate not only athletic prowess, but moral and civic alignment. Controversy is absorbed, reframed, and redirected. Scandal becomes an opportunity for reaffirmation, and the institution's authority is reinforced through cultural, emotional, and ethical mechanisms. Patriotism operates at the intersection of ritual, perception, and mythology, ensuring that professional football remains both a sport and a symbolic bastion of values. Professional football is not only a cultural institution, but a business built on perception, loyalty, and brand integrity. In the modern era, the National Football League's mythology of purity discipline, moral authority, and heroic narrative became as much a financial strategy as a cultural imperative. Corporate sponsors, broadcasting contracts, merchandising, and licensing agreements created a billion-dollar ecosystem in which the perception of ethical conduct was inseparable from economic viability. Purity was no longer simply aspirational or symbolic. It became a financial necessity, a commodity as crucial as athletic competition or television ratings. The league's transformation into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise relied on an interdependent relationship between image and revenue. Sponsors invest in institutions that reflect values consistent with their own brand identity. Viewers engage with organizations that align with their ethical and cultural expectations. Any hint of scandal or moral ambiguity could threaten not only reputation, but revenue streams. The mythology of purity was carefully cultivated to sustain economic confidence, ensuring that commercial partners, media networks, and fans continue to invest emotionally and financially. Ethical perception became a strategic asset, its preservation central to the NFL's financial model. This dynamic was evident in the expansion of media partnerships during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Television contracts, now worth billions annually, were contingent not only on audience numbers, but also on the league's ability to project a controlled and morally coherent narrative. Advertisers demanded an environment in which their products could be associated with family-friendly values, heroism, and ethical conduct. The mythology of purity was reinforced through public relations, ceremonial displays, and strategic messaging, ensuring that corporate and audience trust remained intact. Revenue and ethical perception were inextricably linked. Sponsorship agreements further illustrated the economic significance of moral perception. Major brands invested in the league with the expectation that association would reflect positively on their own reputation. Violations of ethical norms, high-profile scandals, or repeated misconduct pose the risk of public backlash and financial loss. The NFL responded by crafting policies, narratives, and rituals designed to reassure both audiences and commercial partners. Personal conduct rules, media campaigns, and community initiatives functioned simultaneously as ethical guidance and financial insurance. Purity became a mechanism to protect both brand integrity and bottom-line revenue. The emphasis on cleanliness extended beyond the field into marketing, merchandising, and fan engagement. Stadium experiences, community programs, and broadcast presentation all reinforced the mythology of moral discipline. Viewers were presented with heroes whose conduct exemplified the league's values. Narratives of discipline and patriotism, and ceremonies that reflected institutional authority. Corporate partners were offered association with not just athletic excellence, but a culturally and morally coherent organization. The construction of purity was thus a multidimensional strategy, encompassing ethics, perception, and financial sustainability. High-profile scandals provided opportunities to demonstrate the economic value of purity. When controversies arose, the league responded strategically, emphasizing disciplinary action, rehabilitation, and corrective measures. Public attention was redirected toward the institution's ethical management rather than individual failings. Sponsors assured that the league maintained control and alignment with moral expectations, continued their investment. The mythology of purity was leveraged not only to maintain cultural authority, but to secure economic stability. Demonstrating that ethical narrative and financial interest were mutually reinforcing. The integration of ethical perception into financial strategy reflects the sophistication of modern sports governance. The league's executives, public relations teams, and legal counsel are acutely aware that reputation is capital. Scandals, misconduct, and human error are inevitable in any high-profile institution. But the management of these events through narrative framing, policy enforcement, and ceremonial reinforcement ensures that economic and cultural authority remain intact. Purity functions as a strategic resource deployed to protect both credibility and profitability. Television contracts offer one of the clearest illustrations of this principle. Networks negotiate billions of dollars in rights agreements with the expectation that football will deliver not only ratings, but a predictable, ethically coherent narrative. Advertisers demand a cultural environment that is stable, marketable, and morally consistent. The league's mythology of heroism, discipline, and moral authority ensures that games, broadcasts, and media appearances generate value that extends beyond athletic performance. Scandal management, ceremonial patriotism, and policy enforcement are as integral to revenue generation as competition on the field. Fan engagement also reflects the financial importance of purity. Attendance, merchandise sales, and media subscriptions are influenced by public perception. Scandals that undermine trust can translate directly into economic consequences. By emphasizing ethical conduct, heroism, and cultural alignment, the league sustains investment and loyalty. Purity is commoditized, a cultural and economic asset carefully cultivated through policy, narrative, and ritual. The mythology of integrity functions not only as a moral framework, but as a tool for financial preservation and expansion. The economic necessity of purity also shapes institutional responses to crisis, off-field misconduct, injury scandals. And policy controversies are managed with dual objectives: ethical correction and financial reassurance. Communication strategies, disciplinary measures, and public framing are designed to maintain fan confidence, sponsor investment, and media credibility. Institutional authority is reinforced not only by ethical enforcement, but by the demonstration that the league can manage human imperfection without jeopardizing economic stability. Purity becomes both principle and currency. Moreover, the financial dimension of morality has influenced league expansion and globalization. As the NFL markets games internationally, projects fan engagement abroad, and negotiates global broadcasting contracts, the perception of ethical authority becomes essential. International audiences, corporate partners, and foreign media assess not only athletic spectacle, but cultural and ethical coherence. Maintaining a mythology of purity ensures that the league is attractive to diverse markets, reinforcing both revenue potential and global cultural influence. Ethical perception and financial strategy are inseparable in the league's modern operation. Ultimately, the business of cleanliness illustrates how mythology, ethics, and commerce intersect in professional football. The league's history of scandal management, policy enforcement, and symbolic ritual has established a consistent narrative of moral discipline. Corporate sponsors, fans, and media partners invest not only in athletic performance, but in the assurance that the institution operates within predictable ethical boundaries. Purity is a strategic asset, a form of cultural capital converted into financial stability, brand loyalty, and audience trust. Economic imperatives reinforce ethical mythology, and mythology reinforces financial security. The integration of morality into business strategy underscores the sophistication of the league's approach. Scandals, misconduct, and crises are unavoidable. Yet the NFL has demonstrated the capacity to convert these challenges into opportunities for reinforcement. Narrative control, ceremonial symbolism, policy enforcement, and ethical framing ensure that both perception and revenue remain intact. Purity is not incidental. It is a deliberate, codified, and economically vital component of professional football. The mythology of integrity serves culture, ethics, and commerce simultaneously, sustaining the league's authority across decades, crises, and generations of fans. In this way, the National Football League exemplifies a uniquely modern approach to institutional survival. Scandal, human error, and controversy are managed through integrated strategies that protect cultural, ethical, and financial legitimacy. Purity is engineered, cultivated, and communicated as both moral and economic necessity. Fans, sponsors, and media participants receive a coherent narrative that reinforces trust, loyalty, and value. The business of cleanliness ensures that professional football remains both a cultural touchstone and a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, inseparable from its mythology of discipline, virtue, and heroism. The rise of the internet and social media transformed professional football into a sport played as much on digital screens as on stadium turf. The National Football League, once able to carefully curate narratives through traditional media, suddenly faced a world in which information traveled instantly. Rumors spread without mediation, and public scrutiny became constant and global. In this digital age, the mythology of purity, the carefully cultivated image of discipline, heroism, and ethical authority was exposed to unprecedented vulnerability. Scandals that might have been contained, delayed, or reframed in earlier decades now erupted instantly, challenging the league's ability to maintain control over perception. Social media platforms allowed fans, journalists, and whistleblowers to broadcast incidents in real time. Videos of player misconduct, leaked medical information, and reports of off-field behavior could reach millions of viewers within minutes. Traditional public relations strategies, rooted in press releases, controlled interviews, and televised statements, proved inadequate in the face of viral exposure. The league was forced to adapt quickly, developing strategies that balance transparency, rapid response, and narrative control. Image management in the digital era became both more complex and more critical to sustaining mythology and authority. One early example of digital disruption involved a high-profile player controversy. A video surfaced online depicting behavior inconsistent with the league's code of conduct. The speed at which the footage circulated limited the ability of traditional media to shape narrative framing. Within hours, sponsors, fans, and commentators were responding. The league implemented immediate action, releasing statements, initiating investigation, and emphasizing commitment to ethical oversight. The response reflected an understanding that in the digital age, speed of action was as important as the content of action. Delay could amplify damage, while swift and structured communication could reclaim authority. Digital media also altered the power dynamics between fans and the league. Historically, fans consumed narratives curated by journalists and broadcasters. In the digital era, fans became active participants in narrative formation, sharing opinions, creating memes, and amplifying perspectives independent of league messaging. This decentralized narrative challenged traditional mechanisms of mythology reinforcement. The NFL responded by engaging directly through official social media channels, providing real-time updates and controlling the flow of information as much as possible. The league's mythology of purity was now maintained not only through policy and ritual, but through digital presence and engagement. Transparency became a double-edged sword. In an era where concealment was nearly impossible, the league had to balance ethical disclosure with strategic narrative framing. Investigations, medical updates, and disciplinary actions were shared in ways designed to demonstrate accountability while preserving institutional authority. Digital strategy included curated statements, proactive disclosure of reforms, and amplification of positive initiatives such as community service and educational programs. Scandal, once primarily a threat, became a mechanism for demonstrating resilience and ethical oversight, even amid heightened visibility. The viral nature of digital exposure also introduced challenges related to perception management. Leaks, unverified reports, and social media speculation could distort public understanding. The league developed monitoring systems to identify emerging narratives, engage with digital audiences, and intervene in misinformation. Coordinated messaging emphasized corrective action, policy adherence, and moral responsibility. In this environment, mythology was not simply a cultural artifact. It was actively produced, managed, and defended across platforms where millions of voices could simultaneously participate. High-profile social media controversies tested the league's capacity to balance individual expression and institutional expectations. Players using personal accounts to share opinions, engage in political discourse, or react to events created situations in which digital expression intersected with mythology and ethics. The league's responses required careful calibration, sanctions, public statements, and narrative framing were employed to reinforce ethical authority while acknowledging the realities of digital expression. The mythology of purity, once maintained largely through ceremony, policy, and media control, now required continuous digital engagement and strategic interpretation. The digital age also amplified the stakes for commercial interests. Sponsors, advertisers, and media partners closely monitored online discourse, social trends, and fan sentiment. Scandals could provoke backlash, boycott threats, and reputational risk. The NFL's mythology of ethical discipline was essential not only to cultural authority, but to financial stability. Digital exposure demanded rapid, consistent, and visually compelling reinforcement of ethical standards, turning every scandal into both a challenge and an opportunity for demonstrating moral and institutional authority. Furthermore, the speed and permanence of digital content meant that the league had to reconsider the concept of crisis lifecycle. Traditional models in which a scandal could fade with time no longer applied. Videos, posts, and commentary persisted indefinitely, allowing public memory to extend far beyond the initial incident. The NFL adapted by emphasizing long-term narrative management, highlighting reform initiatives, tracking compliance, and continuously reinforcing institutional values. Mythology became a living, ongoing project, maintained actively rather than assumed as inherited. Even the fan experience was reshaped. Audiences were no longer passive consumers, but interactive participants in mythology creation. Hashtags, viral videos, and commentary shaped perceptions of purity, discipline, and heroism. The league responded by cultivating its digital presence, reinforcing values, and framing public understanding through strategic storytelling. Digital engagement became a tool not only for narrative maintenance, but for real-time myth-making, allowing the institution to assert authority in a participatory media landscape. In the digital era, scandal became both more dangerous and more strategically valuable. Exposure, viral dissemination, and public engagement created crises with the potential to undermine mythology. But the league's response could transform these events into demonstrations of ethical oversight. Rapid investigation, transparent communication, and amplified narratives of accountability turned digital risk into opportunity for reaffirming authority. Mythology was no longer maintained solely through tradition and ceremony. It was continuously negotiated, performed, and reinforced through digital strategy. Ultimately, the digital age redefined the league's relationship with scandal, mythology, and authority. The speed, scope, and permanence of information challenged traditional methods of image control, requiring innovation, rapid response, and continuous engagement. The NFL's mythology of purity was no longer a passive cultural artifact. It became an active, digitally mediated construct. Scandal, once primarily a threat to reputation, could now be leveraged as evidence of resilience, ethical oversight, and institutional competence. Digital exposure demanded adaptation, and the league's capacity to survive and thrive in this environment reflects the sophistication of its modern approach to mythology, perception, and ethical authority. In the modern National Football League, the intersection of scandal, perception, and commercial strategy has evolved into a sophisticated apparatus in which redemption narratives are as valuable as athletic performance. The mythology of purity, once maintained primarily through discipline, ritual, and policy enforcement, became increasingly intertwined with stories of comeback, resilience, and personal transformation. Players who had fallen from grace were presented not merely as athletes returning to the field, but as embodiments of moral and cultural redemption. These narratives were carefully curated, amplified, and monetized, allowing the league to convert scandal into opportunity and maintain both its mythology and its economic engine. Redemption stories function on multiple levels. They address the human need for moral closure, offering audiences a narrative arc in which failure, transgression, or misconduct is followed by accountability, reform, and renewed virtue. In the context of professional football, these stories serve the dual purpose of re-engaging fans and reinforcing institutional authority. A player who had been involved in scandal, for example, could be portrayed as learning from past mistakes, adhering to league policies, and ultimately returning to a position of respect and heroism. The mythology of purity was reinforced not by the absence of failure, but by the capacity for ethical and personal recovery. The strategic deployment of redemption narratives also reflects a broader understanding of audience psychology. Fans are drawn to stories of human imperfection, followed by triumph, resonating with themes of resilience, accountability, and moral alignment. The league capitalized on this dynamic, integrating redemption arcs into broadcasts, press releases, and marketing campaigns. A carefully managed return from suspension, a public statement of contrition, or an off-field community initiative became more than individual milestones. They were narrative tools that reinforced institutional credibility while maintaining emotional engagement with audiences. This approach is evident in multiple high-profile cases. When a player involved in a widely publicized misconduct incident returned to the league, the framing emphasized learning, accountability, and transformation. Interviews highlighted personal reflection and growth. Community service initiatives were showcased, and team leadership roles reinforced ethical realignment. Fans and media were presented with a coherent story. The league held individuals accountable, provided pathways for redemption, and upheld its values consistently. The narrative reinforced the mythology of integrity while simultaneously sustaining public interest and engagement. Redemption narratives also serve as a buffer against cumulative reputational damage. Scandal, by its nature, threatens trust in the institution, but the demonstration of successful reintegration reinforces the league's ethical authority. The institution is portrayed as both just and rehabilitative, capable of managing human imperfection without undermining its broader mythology. This dynamic allows the NFL to absorb controversy, maintain narrative control, and even leverage high-profile incidents to reinforce moral authority. Redemption becomes a tool for myth-making, crisis management, and audience reassurance. Commercial interests amplify the value of these narratives. Sponsors, media partners, and advertisers are invested not only in athletic spectacle, but in the ethical perception of the league and its players. Redemption stories provide opportunities to associate brands with narratives of resilience, moral growth, and cultural relevance. Public relations campaigns, broadcast storytelling, and social media amplification turn personal recovery into collective engagement, translating moral narratives into economic value. In this sense, redemption is not merely a cultural or ethical strategy. It is a financial one as well. The NFL's mastery of redemption narratives is rooted in decades of scandal management. Early crises were addressed through concealment, narrative framing, and policy enforcement, while later eras emphasized ritual, patriotism, and ethical symbolism. In the digital age, the league learned to adapt these strategies to a media landscape in which scandals could no longer be hidden, but where stories of transformation could be amplified instantly and globally. Redemption became both a mechanism for damage control and a deliberate component of mythology, ensuring that purity remains central even in a climate of constant exposure. Redemption narratives are also intimately tied to the mythology of heroism. Professional football relies on the notion that players are more than athletes. They are cultural icons whose behavior reflects values larger than the sport itself. Fallibility humanizes them, while redemption reaffirms moral and institutional authority. Fans are encouraged to witness not only physical performance, but ethical and personal growth. The league, in turn, maintains its narrative of discipline, virtue, and resilience, demonstrating that while transgressions may occur, the mythology of integrity is enduring and adaptable. The effectiveness of this strategy is magnified by media and audience engagement. Stories of redemption are serialized, covered in feature profiles, and discussed extensively across digital and traditional channels. Public perception is managed through carefully curated messaging that emphasizes accountability, reform, and contribution to both team and community. The narrative arc transforms scandal from a threat into a story of institutional and individual resilience. Fans are invited to participate emotionally, forming connections that strengthen loyalty, engagement, and identification with both players and the league as an institution. Critically, these narratives are designed to balance accountability with optimism. The league acknowledges human imperfection without ceding control over mythology. Players are held responsible, but the story emphasizes growth and reintegration. Redemption narratives reinforce the message that the institution is both ethically sound and capable of fostering transformation. The mythology of purity is sustained not by denying failure, but by demonstrating that ethical principles, personal responsibility, and institutional oversight can guide recovery and reaffirm trust. In many ways, the commercialization of redemption narratives reflects the culmination of strategies developed over decades. Scandals in early professional football were concealed or reframed. Ceremonial and patriotic rituals reinforced ethical authority, and policy frameworks codified moral expectations. In the modern era, the narrative of personal recovery provides an additional layer, allowing the league to maintain mythology, engage fans emotionally, and convert ethical oversight into economic opportunity. Redemption has become both a cultural and financial instrument, blending morality, perception, and commerce into a cohesive institutional strategy. These narratives also illustrate the sophisticated interplay between individual and collective mythology. The player's story of transformation reinforces personal credibility while simultaneously enhancing the league's authority. Fans are presented with a seamless integration of ethical oversight, institutional resilience, and cultural significance. Redemption narratives provide a mechanism for absorbing scandal, sustaining engagement, reinforcing the mythology of purity that underpins both cultural influence and financial success. Ultimately, the strategic deployment of redemption stories demonstrates the NFL's capacity to adapt its mythology to changing social and media landscapes. Scandals, misconduct, and exposure are inevitable. But the league has institutionalized methods for converting these challenges into opportunities for narrative reinforcement and audience engagement. Personal recovery becomes a symbol of institutional authority, moral oversight, and cultural relevance. The mythology of purity is sustained not by denial or concealment, but by the deliberate cultivation of stories in which accountability, resilience, and redemption converge. The league's ability to profit from these narratives underscores the inseparability of mythology, culture, and commerce. Redemption is not merely symbolic. It reinforces fan loyalty, secures sponsor confidence, and ensures media engagement. It converts human fallibility into opportunity for ethical affirmation, narrative cohesion, and financial stability. In this context, personal transformation becomes both a moral lesson and a strategic tool, demonstrating the modern sophistication of the NFL's approach to scandal, mythology, and institutional authority. Throughout the history of professional football, the mythology of purity has depended not only on the league's strategic management, but on the willingness of fans to embrace it. While scandals, misconduct, and human error have been constant companions of the sport, the narrative presented by the NFL heroes, discipline, patriotism, and moral clarity has been consistently accepted, celebrated, and reinforced by the audience. Fans are not passive recipients of mythology. They are active participants in constructing and perpetuating the story. America has, in countless ways, chosen to accept the purified version of football, often overlooking contradictions because the mythology serves deeper cultural, emotional, and social needs. The first reason for this acceptance lies in emotional resonance. Football, from its earliest days, has been a site for emotional investment, identity formation, and communal experience. Fans connect with players as symbols, coaches as architects of strategy and leadership, and teams as embodiments of regional and cultural identity. The mythology of purity provides a framework in which these connections can flourish without the dissonance that scandal or imperfection might introduce. By choosing to believe in heroism, integrity, and discipline, fans protect their emotional investment and reinforce their own sense of moral and cultural alignment with the sport. Cultural factors also play a central role. The NFL's mythology mirrors broader American values: individual achievement within a collective framework, discipline and perseverance, loyalty and patriotism. Fans recognize themselves in these narratives, finding reflection of societal ideals and aspirational models. The league's strategic projection of virtue resonates precisely because it aligns with the cultural ethos of the audience. Purified narratives reinforce not only admiration for athletes, but identification with larger cultural norms, offering a sense of coherence and stability in a complex and often contradictory social environment. There is also an element of narrative convenience. Scandals, misconduct, and crises are psychologically uncomfortable. They introduce moral ambiguity and cognitive dissonance. Fans who choose the myth are engaging in a process of selective attention, focusing on the stories that reinforce clarity, heroism, and order, while minimizing or reframing contradictions. This is not necessarily conscious deception, but a natural mechanism for preserving emotional engagement and sustaining loyalty. The mythology is easier to embrace than the messy reality of human behavior, and this psychological preference reinforces the league's capacity to project purity. Media and storytelling amplify this choice. Coverage of football often emphasizes triumph, discipline, and perseverance over misconduct, framing scandal as either isolated, corrected, or secondary to heroic narrative. Interviews, feature stories, and broadcasts highlight personal growth, redemption, and ethical realignment. Social media allows fans to engage in collective reinforcement of the myth, sharing stories of heroism, celebrating discipline, and reframing controversy in ways that maintain loyalty and emotional investment. Fans participate actively in the maintenance of mythology, choosing to elevate stories that confirm moral alignment while minimizing attention to disruptive elements. Historical precedent also matters. From the early scandals of the 1920s to the complex crises of the digital age, the NFL has repeatedly demonstrated its capacity to manage narrative, control perception, and reframe controversy. Fans, having experienced these cycles, often adopt an implicit trust in the institution's authority. There is a cultural expectation that while individual mistakes may occur, the league itself maintains ethical oversight and moral rectitude. This trust, cultivated over decades, encourages fans to accept the mythology as both credible and emotionally satisfying, reinforcing the league's authority and stabilizing cultural perception. The social dimension is equally significant. Football functions as a communal experience, with families, communities, and regional identity intertwined with team affiliation. Mythology facilitates cohesion. It provides a shared story that fans can celebrate together, offering moral and emotional clarity that extends beyond the field. Controversy threatens cohesion, but purified narratives restore it, ensuring that collective identification with teams and players remains intact. Choosing the myth is therefore also a social act, one that maintains connection, tradition, and collective meaning within the football community. Patriotism, deeply embedded in the league's mythology, further reinforces the choice. The ritualized observation of national symbols, the alignment of athletic excellence with civic virtue, and the framing of football as an extension of American values provide multiple layers of ethical and emotional reinforcement. Fans participate in these rituals willingly, absorbing the mythology as an affirmation of both national identity and personal alignment with societal ideals. Scandal, while acknowledged, is often filtered through these layers, enabling audiences to maintain attachment to both cultural and moral narratives. There is also an aspirational element. Fans project their own desires, values, and ethical ideals onto the mythology of purity. Athletes become exemplars of resilience, discipline, and heroism. The narrative of the final season of redemption, or of overcoming personal adversity, is not only compelling, it is psychologically reinforcing. By embracing these stories, fans participate in a process of moral and emotional affirmation, experiencing both vicarious triumph and reassurance that ethical conduct is rewarded. The mythology becomes a conduit for personal and collective aspiration. The selective acceptance of mythology also allows the NFL to convert scandal into opportunity. When fans choose to believe, when they engage emotionally with redemptive arcs, patriotic symbolism, or narrative reframing, controversy is absorbed into the larger narrative rather than destabilizing it. Scandals become secondary to myth-making, reinforcing the institution's authority and perpetuating the perception of ethical discipline. The audience's willingness to embrace purity ensures that mythology remains resilient even as human behavior challenges its boundaries. Finally, the choice to accept mythology is a reflection of the human desire for order, clarity, and meaning. Football provides a structured environment in which complexity, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity are managed through narrative, ritual, and symbolism. Fans choose the myth not only because it is comforting, but because it fulfills deep emotional and cultural needs. Heroism, discipline, and virtue are easier to integrate into personal and communal identity than the messy reality of scandal. The league's ability to maintain the perception of purity is inseparable from this psychological and cultural willingness. America's embrace of the NFL's purified mythology is therefore both strategic and voluntary. The league's management of scandal, narrative framing, and symbolic ritual provides the framework. But fans actively choose to participate, to believe, and to reinforce the mythology. This choice sustains emotional engagement, cultural alignment, and economic investment. It ensures that despite decades of scandal, controversy, and human imperfection, the narrative of heroism, discipline, and moral authority remains central to professional football. In the end, the mythology of purity persists not because it is absolute, but because it is collectively reinforced. Fans, motivated by emotion, culture, aspiration, and social cohesion, select the version of football that aligns with virtue, heroism, and national identity. The league provides the scaffolding, but the audience chooses to embrace it. Mythology, scandal management, and redemption converge in a dynamic process in which culture, emotion, and perception are inseparable, ensuring that professional football remains both a sport and a symbol of values the nation willingly endorses. In the contemporary National Football League, the mythology of purity has become a nearly unbreakable shield, a constructed identity that dominates public perception even as scandals continue to emerge. The league's history of crisis management, narrative control, and myth-making has culminated in an institution that projects ethical authority, discipline, and heroism with a precision that few other organizations can match. The shield of morality, cultivated over nearly a century, has grown so robust that it often eclipses the truth, creating a perception of integrity that is as powerful as it is enduring. The modern shield functions on multiple levels. It encompasses policy frameworks, media engagement, ceremonial rituals, corporate sponsorships, and public narratives of heroism. The league has codified ethical expectation into its governance, employing personal conduct policies, concussion protocols, and community programs to reinforce the perception of virtue. These mechanisms are designed not only to manage behavior, but to produce a public image that aligns with the mythology of purity. Even when controversies arise, the shield absorbs and reframes them, protecting the league's core identity from erosion. Scandal continues to shape the shield, paradoxically strengthening it. Each incident, from off-field misconduct to emerging medical revelations, offers an opportunity for the league to demonstrate moral oversight. Investigations, suspensions, and public relations campaigns transform crisis into evidence of ethical authority. Fans and sponsors are reassured that the institution is self-regulating, disciplined, and morally conscious. The very existence of scandal reinforces the narrative that the league is vigilant, capable, and committed to its own principles. Paradoxically, the more the league manages controversy effectively, the stronger the mythology becomes. The shield's durability is also rooted in the league's mastery of storytelling. Through decades of careful narrative framing, the NFL has embedded ethical and heroic ideals into the cultural consciousness. The mythology of purity is so deeply intertwined with American identity that the league's ethical image often persists independent of evidence to the contrary. Fans, corporate partners, and media entities participate in maintaining this perception, amplifying the shield through engagement, coverage, and cultural investment. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle in which mythology, exposure, and authority continuously strengthen one another. Digital media has further complicated and strengthened the shield. The instantaneous dissemination of information could have weakened the league's mythology, but in practice, it has become a tool for reinforcement. Transparency, rapid response, and narrative framing allow the league to control the interpretation of scandal, emphasizing accountability, transformation, and institutional authority. Fans, participating in the amplification of these narratives, become co-authors of the mythology, reinforcing the shield through collective belief. Even in the age of viral exposure, the NFL has learned to wield the digital environment to protect and enhance its purified identity. The shield also extends into financial and commercial realms. Sponsors, advertisers, and media partners rely on the league's mythology to justify investment, associating their brands with heroism, ethical oversight, and cultural coherence. Each successful management of scandal, each narrative of redemption, and each demonstration of institutional authority reinforces economic confidence. Purity has become both an ethical and financial asset, a mechanism that ensures cultural authority while protecting revenue streams. The shield is therefore simultaneously moral, cultural, and commercial. Institutional responses are meticulously calibrated to maintain the shield. Investigations are thorough yet manage to project competence. Media statements are structured to reinforce ethical oversight. Ceremonial displays of patriotism, community engagement, and player recognition underscore the mythology of virtue. Every incident is an opportunity to demonstrate control, discipline, and moral authority. The shield is dynamic, responsive, and continuously reinforced, ensuring that perception of integrity is rarely challenged even as reality remains complex and often messy. Redemption narratives remain central to the shield's resilience. Players who falter, who confront scandal, or who suffer public scrutiny are reintegrated through stories of accountability, reform, and ethical realignment. These narratives are amplified across media channels, providing audiences with evidence that the institution is both just and capable of fostering transformation. Redemption is simultaneously a cultural, ethical, and commercial mechanism, reinforcing the mythology while sustaining engagement and loyalty. The shield is strengthened each time a fallen player returns to embody the league's ideals. The shield's durability is further supported by fan complicity. Audiences emotionally invested in the mythology of heroism, discipline, and ethical authority actively participate in maintaining the perception of purity. Fans embrace redemption arcs, accept narrative framing, and often overlook contradictions to preserve emotional and cultural coherence. The mythology is chosen, celebrated, and reinforced by those who consume it. In this sense, the shield is not imposed unilaterally, but co-constructed, a product of institutional strategy and collective willingness. Even as new scandals emerge, the shield adapts rather than collapses. Off-field misconduct, medical revelations, and controversies surrounding policy enforcement are absorbed into existing structures of narrative, ritual, and symbolic authority. Each challenge is reframed as a test of the institution's ethical oversight, providing evidence of both vigilance and resilience. The shield is elastic, capable of incorporating disruption while preserving the mythology of purity. It is a living construct, continuously strengthened through engagement, adaptation, and demonstration of institutional competence. The modern shield also illustrates the tension between truth and perception. While scandals and misconduct persist, the mythology projected by the league often supersedes factual realities in the public imagination. Fans and commercial partners engage with the purified version, accepting the narrative of ethical authority even when evidence suggests complexity or contradiction. The shield functions as both protection and enhancement, shaping understanding, reinforcing belief, and maintaining authority despite the presence of unresolved controversy. Ultimately, the NFL's mythology of purity has become stronger than the truth itself. Scandals, crises, and human imperfection no longer threaten the institution's identity. They are reframed as evidence of vigilance, ethical oversight, and narrative mastery. The shield is cultural, financial, and symbolic, maintained through policy, media, ritual, redemption, and fan participation. It represents an achievement of institutional sophistication, a testament to the league's capacity to transform exposure, vulnerability, and controversy into enduring authority. The modern shield is therefore paradoxical. It is born of scandal, yet resistant to it. It is reinforced by exposure, yet remains coherent. It is simultaneously a cultural artifact, a financial asset, and a moral statement. Players, fans, sponsors, and media all participate in sustaining it, demonstrating the enduring power of mythology in shaping perception. The shield illustrates how a deeply human institution, fraught with imperfection, ambition, and controversy can construct an identity that transcends individual behavior, historical scandal, and the messy realities of professional sport. In this way, the National Football League today exists as both a reflection of and a response to its history. Its mythology of purity, cultivated over decades of scandal, crisis, and adaptation, remains central to its authority, its cultural influence, and its economic power. Scandals continue to arise, but the shield absorbs them, reframes them, and transforms them into proof of resilience. The league's ethical identity is now nearly unbreakable, a testament to the sophistication of its narrative construction and the willingness of fans, media, and partners to embrace, reinforce, and perpetuate it. The modern Shield is the culmination of nearly a century of strategy, crisis management, and mythology building. It demonstrates that professional football is as much a cultural and ethical institution as it is a sport. Purity, discipline, and heroism are maintained not only through individual conduct, but through institutional foresight, narrative control, and collective participation. The league's identity, forged in scandal and refined through centuries of management, has become a nearly unassailable construct, a shield that protects both mythology and truth while shaping the perception of professional football for generations to come. Looking back across the nearly century-long arc of professional football, the mythology of purity that the National Football League has cultivated appears at once inspiring and paradoxical. On the surface, the league stands as a cultural institution celebrated for its heroes, its disciplined competition, and the rituals that have become woven into the American imagination. Fans admire players not only for their athletic prowess, but for the symbolic embodiment of virtue, perseverance, and moral integrity. But beneath the layers of spectacle and ceremony lies a history of scandal, crisis, and calculated narrative construction. The very identity of purity, it becomes clear, was never simply a natural inheritance. It was a crafted and defended construct, born out of necessity, maintained through discipline, and protected through strategic myth-making. The process of constructing this mythology has demanded a remarkable combination of institutional foresight, media mastery, and social persuasion. From the early gambling scandals of the 1920s to the concussion revelations of the modern era, the league has repeatedly confronted crises that threatened both its authority and its cultural legitimacy. Each scandal presented a choice: exposure and vulnerability, or intervention and control. The league consistently chose the latter, transforming crises into instruments of narrative reinforcement. Scandal became a tool, a mechanism through which ethical oversight, policy development, and heroic symbolism were both demonstrated and amplified. In this light, purity was not the absence of wrongdoing. It was the presence of control, the careful management of perception, and the deliberate cultivation of trust in the institution itself. This history invites a deeper question about whether purity can truly exist in an environment defined by human imperfection and recurring crisis. If heroism is defined by ethical conduct, and morality is constructed through narrative framing rather than individual action alone, then purity becomes less a state of being than a performance maintained by institutions, media, and audiences. The NFL has demonstrated that it is possible to project an image of ethical perfection, even as human behavior deviates from the ideal. The mythology of virtue persists, not because individual actors are flawless, but because the institution is adept at controlling perception, emphasizing redemption, and shaping collective memory. In this sense, purity is real in appearance, but always mediated by narrative, strategy, and expectation. Yet this achievement comes at a human cost. Players, coaches, and staff navigate a world in which personal behavior is scrutinized. Missteps are amplified, and redemption is often both prescribed and commercialized. Scandals are managed in ways that can prioritize institutional mythology over individual truth. Redemption arcs, while uplifting in narrative, can place immense pressure on those involved to conform to expectations of public contrition, moral growth, and symbolic heroism. The personal, emotional, and psychological labor required to participate in these narratives is often invisible, leaving behind consequences that are quietly absorbed but rarely acknowledged. The mythology of purity, while socially and commercially effective, is therefore built upon a delicate human calculus. Individual well-being, reputations, and even mental health are all weighed against the necessity of sustaining the illusion of ethical perfection. Audiences, too, participate in this negotiation of truth and mythology. Fans embrace narratives of heroism, discipline, and redemption, often overlooking or reframing contradictions to preserve the emotional and cultural coherence that football provides. This choice is not passive. It is active engagement with a story that satisfies emotional, psychological, and social needs. Fans accept the purified version of football because it offers stability, communal identity, and a moral framework that resonates with broader cultural ideals. The mythology works precisely because people are willing to invest in it, to believe in the ethical narrative even when it may conflict with reality. In this sense, the NFL's shield of purity is co-created, dependent not only on institutional management, but on the collective participation of audiences and stakeholders. The legacy of this process is both remarkable and complicated. The NFL today is an institution of extraordinary cultural and economic influence, capable of shaping narratives, guiding public perception, and reinforcing ideals of virtue on a national scale. Its mythology of purity is robust, enduring, and deeply integrated into American identity. Yet it is inseparable from its history of crisis, from the scandals that forced reinvention, and from the strategies of narrative control that have defined its growth. The shield of morality is both a testament to institutional skill and a reflection of human willingness to accept curated truth over messy reality. Ultimately, the story of the NFL's image management invites reflection on broader questions about truth, identity, and the role of mythology in society. Institutions, communities, and audiences continually navigate tensions between reality and narrative, between imperfection and expectation. Football provides a lens through which these dynamics are visible, dramatized, and amplified. The mythology of purity, while specific to the NFL, reflects a universal human desire for order, heroism, and moral clarity. It demonstrates how culture can embrace narrative construction to create meaning, maintain cohesion, and reinforce values, even in the presence of ongoing contradiction and imperfection. The human cost, the strategic orchestration, and the cultural acceptance of mythology converge to produce an institution that is both awe-inspiring and morally complex. Players are celebrated as heroes while navigating pressures to conform to symbolic ideals. Fans are emotionally invested in a narrative that may obscure reality. The league itself stands as both arbiter and architect of its ethical image, demonstrating a capacity for foresight, adaptation, and myth-making that few organizations can rival. The story of scandal, redemption, and mythology is therefore inseparable from the story of professional football itself. As the NFL moves forward, the mythology of purity will continue to shape perception, inform behavior, and guide institutional decision-making. Scandals will persist, as human imperfection is inevitable. Redemption will remain a central tool for narrative reinforcement, and fans will continue to embrace the mythology they have helped sustain. The legacy of this process is a testament to the power of narrative, the resilience of culture, and the complexity of human engagement with ethics, performance, and identity. Football is more than a sport. It is a reflection of social values, a site of cultural negotiation, and a living experiment in the construction of morality. The enduring lesson is that purity in professional football is not a natural inheritance. It is a carefully constructed, continuously maintained, and culturally reinforced mythology. It demonstrates the interplay between scandal and narrative, between imperfection and perception, and between human cost and institutional gain. Fans, players, and executives all participate in sustaining this mythology, creating a shared story in which the league appears both heroic and morally unassailable. Truth exists, but it is mediated, reframed, and curated to align with the values, expectations, and desires of the broader cultural audience. In the final reckoning, the story of the NFL's image management is both a cautionary tale and an extraordinary example of institutional strategy. It illustrates the power of myth-making, the resilience of perception, and the ways in which human culture negotiates the tension between reality and narrative. The mythology of purity endures not because the league is without scandal, but because it has mastered the art of transforming scandal into evidence of control, oversight, and ethical authority. It is a shield, a story, and a cultural artifact that shapes both the sport and the society that embraces it. The legacy of this history is inseparable from the experience of professional football. Every touchdown, every comeback, every public act of heroism exists within the framework of mythology shaped by crisis, redemption, and strategic narrative. Fans choose to believe, players navigate the expectations, and the league maintains authority, creating a continuum in which purity, scandal, and cultural meaning are intertwined. The story of football is therefore not only a story of sport, but a story of human values, collective imagination, and the enduring power of narrative to shape perception, identity, and legacy. Professional football, in its modern form, is a monument to both human achievement and human artifice. Its mythology of purity is a testament to resilience, foresight, and the cultural willingness to embrace narrative over unvarnished truth. Scandal has shaped it, crisis has defined it, and mythology has sustained it. The human cost, the ethical negotiation, and the cultural participation required to maintain this shield are immense. Yet the result is an institution that is simultaneously heroic, flawed, and unassailably influential. In the end, the NFL's story is a story of balance between reality and perception, between imperfection and the myth of virtue. Its identity is a construct, reinforced by institutional skill, audience engagement, and narrative control. Purity exists not as a fact, but as a chosen belief, maintained through decades of adaptation, storytelling, and cultural negotiation. It is a reflection of human aspiration, the desire for moral clarity, and the enduring capacity of myth to shape institutions, identities, and legacy. The mythology of professional football will endure, sustained by fans, amplified by narrative, and protected by a history of crisis management. It is a testament to the power of story, the fragility of human behavior, and the enduring influence of institutions that understand both. In this complex, often contradictory landscape, the league has achieved something extraordinary. It has built a cultural shield stronger than the truth itself. And in doing so, it has created a legacy that will shape American consciousness, identity, and the very perception of heroism for generations to come.